The grand ballroom fell silent as Rowan Blackridge's voice cut through the music. Marriage, it's just business. She came with land I needed, nothing more than a strategic asset. Champagne glasses froze midair. Investors nodded approvingly. But behind him, unnoticed in the shadows, Elena Viremont stood perfectly still, her face carved from ice. She'd suspected. Now she knew. Her husband hadn't just married her for convenience. He'd never seen her as human at all. What happened next would shatter an empire and prove that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a man who controls everything. It's a woman who decides she's done being controlled. Stay until the end to see how this story unfolds. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. The Blackridge estate didn't whisper wealth. It shouted it from every marble column and crystal chandelier. 23 rooms, each one designed to remind visitors that Rowan Blackridge owned half the railways in the Eastern Territories and had his fingers in steel mills, shipping yards, and enough political pockets to make governors sweat. Rowan stood in his study, reviewing ledgers with the same cold precision he applied to everything. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't disappoint. At 34, he'd built an empire on one simple principle. Everything had a price, and everything could be measured. The Hartford extension is 3 weeks behind schedule, his chief engineer reported, shifting his weight nervously. Weather's been... I don't pay you to make excuses about weather, Rowan interrupted without looking up. I pay you to build railways regardless of weather. The contract specifies completion by October 1st. That's not a suggestion. Yes, sir. Of course, sir. Is there anything else? The engineer hesitated. The workers are asking about safety equipment again. After what happened in Pittsburgh was negligence, not insufficient equipment. Our men know the risks when they sign on. Rowan finally glanced up, his gray eyes flat as river stones. Tell them their wages already account for hazard. If they're unsatisfied, there are 50 men waiting at every work site who'll take their places. The engineer left quickly. Rowan returned to his numbers. He'd learned young that sentiment was expensive. His father had loved his mother desperately, written her poems, bought her flowers every week, and when she died of fever, the old man had collapsed so completely that creditors picked the family business apart, like vultures on a carcass. 12-year-old Rowan had watched everything sold at auction to pay debts his father had ignored while mooning over a woman who couldn't save him from bankruptcy. Never again. Rowan rebuilt from nothing through sheer calculation. He bought failed companies at rock bottom, stripped them for parts, reinvested profits into infrastructure everyone else thought too risky. While competitors worried about worker morale and public opinion, he cut costs and drove progress with mechanical efficiency. By 28, he owned the Blackridge Rail Company. By 30, he'd absorbed 3 competitors. By 32, his lines connected every major city from Boston to Chicago. But there was one problem his money couldn't solve: the Viremont land. The Viremont estate sat on a perfect junction point for his proposed western expansion, a route that would cut shipping times by 40% and destroy his remaining competition. He'd offered to buy it. Old Jacques Viremont had refused every offer, no matter how generous. My family has held this land for 3 generations, the elderly man had said during their last meeting. It's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. Not to men like you. Viremont had actually laughed. You see land, I see history. You see profit. I see my grandfather's sweat in that soil. Rowan had left that meeting furious. But anger, he'd learned, was just another variable to control. 2 months later, he'd found his solution. Jacques Viremont had one daughter, Elena. 26, educated in Paris, recently returned after her mother's death to help her ailing father manage the estate. According to Rowan's investigators, she was intelligent but impractical, prone to charity work and poetry, exactly the kind of sentimental creature he normally avoided. Perfect. He'd begun courting her with the same systematic approach he applied to hostile acquisitions. Flowers delivered precisely on schedule. Dinner invitations to the finest restaurants. Carefully selected compliments about her dress, her conversation, her education. Never anything too personal, but enough to suggest interest. Elena had seemed charmed but cautious. She asked questions about his work, his plans, his philosophy. He'd answered honestly, mostly. He did find her intelligent. He did appreciate her education. He simply failed to mention that he found these qualities useful rather than attractive. 6 months of calculated courtship culminated in a proposal delivered in her father's study with Jacques present. "I know this is somewhat unconventional," Rowan had said, "but I believe in honest business dealings. Mr. Viremont, you need someone to secure your daughter's future. Elena, you need someone who can maintain your family's legacy. I can provide both. In return, I would like to incorporate the estate into my Western expansion plans. The land would remain in the family, your family, our family, but utilized for progress rather than sitting idle." Jacques had looked ready to throw him out, but Elena had touched her father's arm. "Let me speak with him alone, Papa." When the old man left, she'd studied Rowan for a long moment. "You're not in love with me," she'd said quietly. "Love is a luxury I can't afford, but I will provide for you, protect you, give you a life of comfort and security. That's more than most marriages offer. And the land will be developed responsibly. Your father's legacy will fund the future instead of crumbling into the past." She'd been silent for what felt like hours. Then, "I have one condition. My father lives out his days on the estate, undisturbed, in the main house. Your railways can be built around it, but not through it." Agreed. They'd married 3 weeks later in a ceremony that cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. Rowan had calculated every detail, the guest list designed to impress investors, the venue chosen for its proximity to financial district hotels, even the timing scheduled to coincide with a major stock offering. Their wedding night had been polite and mechanical. Elena had seemed neither disappointed nor surprised. Rowan had felt nothing except relief that this particular transaction was complete. That was 8 months ago. Since then, Elena had settled into the Blackridge estate like a piece of expensive furniture, present but unobtrusive. She managed the household staff, attended social functions when required, and spent her free time reading in the library or tending the gardens. They rarely spoke beyond logistics. Rowan found the arrangement ideal. She didn't make emotional demands. She didn't complain about his long hours or frequent business trips. She simply existed in parallel to his life, requiring minimal maintenance. Tonight's gala was typical of their arrangement. The Merchants Association annual dinner, 200 of the most powerful industrialists, financiers, and politicians in the eastern states gathered to network and posture. Rowan attended these events the way generals attended war councils, identifying allies, measuring threats, calculating angles. Elena wore a deep blue silk gown that Rowan's secretary had selected from a catalog. She looked elegant in the way expensive things generally did, polished, appropriate, unremarkable. She greeted guests with practiced grace, made appropriate small talk, and orbited through the ballroom, making him look respectable and established. Exactly what he'd paid for. Rowan stood near the bar with Thomas Wickshire, a railroad investor from Philadelphia, and Senator Morrison, who controlled several key regulatory committees. Whiskey in hand, surrounded by men who measured success in tonnage and quarterly dividends. "Your Western expansion is bold," Wickshire was saying. "Some would say reckless." "Caution is expensive," Rowan replied. "The freight market is shifting. In 5 years, whoever controls the Western routes will control the industry. I intend to be that person." Morrison laughed. "Must be nice having land fall into your lap through matrimony. Saves on acquisition costs." "Smart business is about leveraging all available assets," Rowan said. "Speaking of assets," Wickshire glanced across the ballroom where Elena stood talking with the governor's wife. "Your bride is certainly decorative. French education, isn't it? Viremont breeding?" "The land was the primary consideration," Rowan said flatly. "The rest is incidental." Morrison raised his glass. "Honest man! Most of these fools pretend their marriages are love matches while privately keeping mistresses. You at least admit what we all know, marriage is just another business arrangement." "Exactly." Rowan sipped his whiskey. "She came with assets I needed. The emotional component is irrelevant. It's purely strategic. She's just an asset that happened to come with useful connections and acceptable social graces." Wickshire chuckled. "Asset with acceptable social graces? I'll have to remember that phrasing when my wife asks why I married her." They all laughed. The kind of knowing, cynical laughter that echoed through rooms where men convinced themselves that reducing everything to transactions made them wise rather than hollow. Rowan didn't notice the conversation behind him stop. Didn't see Elena freeze mid-sentence, her champagne glass suspended halfway to her lips. Didn't register the way the governor's wife's expression shifted from polite interest to horrified fascination. He was too busy calculating how to leverage Morrison's regulatory influence for his pending expansion permits, already 3 moves ahead in a game where people were just pieces on his mental chessboard. The key, he continued, is maintaining clear boundaries. Sentiment clouds judgment. My father loved my mother to distraction, and it destroyed him when she died. I learned young, keep business business, keep emotions irrelevant, and you'll never be vulnerable. Cold but effective, Morrison agreed. Not cold, practical. Rowan finished his whiskey. You can't build empires on feelings. You build them on strategy, leverage, and knowing the exact value of every asset you control. Wickshire glanced past Rowan's shoulder, his smile faltering slightly. Speaking of assets, I believe yours is... But Rowan was already moving toward a cluster of railroad executives, his mind already shifting to the next calculation, the next negotiation, the next conquest. He didn't see Elena set down her champagne glass with such precise care that it didn't make a sound. Didn't see her excuse herself from the governor's wife with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Didn't see her walk, not run, walk with perfect composure, toward the powder room, her silk gown whispering against marble floors. The governor's wife touched her husband's arm, whispering urgently. Several conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. A ripple of awareness spread through the ballroom like ice crystals forming on a window. Rowan noticed none of it. He was deep in discussion about freight tonnage and quarterly projections when Elena emerged from the powder room 15 minutes later. Her face was perfectly composed, her posture flawless, her expression pleasant and neutral. She rejoined the party as if nothing had happened, smiled at the right moments, laughed at appropriate jokes, played her role with such practiced perfection that anyone watching might think she hadn't heard a thing. But several people had seen her face in those first seconds after Rowan's words landed. The governor's wife would later describe it to her closest friends as watching someone's soul leave their body while they remained standing. The party continued for 3 more hours. Rowan worked the room with mechanical precision, securing tentative commitments for his western expansion, identifying new investment opportunities, strengthening alliances with key political figures. When he finally decided it was time to leave, he found Elena near the entrance, already wearing her wrap, waiting with the same patient composure she applied to everything. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes." They rode home in silence, which wasn't unusual. Elena stared out the carriage window at gaslit streets rolling past. Rowan reviewed mental notes from the evening's conversations, already drafting telegrams he'd send in the morning. At the estate, Elena went directly upstairs. Rowan headed to his study to record the night's business developments in his journal. Successful evening. Morrison softening on expansion permits. Wickshire interested in infrastructure bonds. Western route timeline accelerating ahead of projections. He didn't go to Elena's bedroom. They'd stopped maintaining even the pretense of intimacy months ago. Another efficiency. No need to waste time on biological necessities that served no productive purpose. Rowan slept soundly, dreamlessly, the way men sleep when they believe they've mastered every variable in their lives. He had no idea that in the room down the hall, Elena lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, her hands folded across her stomach with such stillness that she might have been carved from marble. No tears, no dramatics, just absolute crystalline clarity. She'd suspected for months that Rowan didn't love her, suspected he'd married her for strategic reasons, that their arrangement was more contract than relationship, suspected but not known, and there's a vast difference between suspicion and certainty. Now she knew. Not suspected. Knew. Just an asset. The words played on loop in her mind, each repetition stripping away another layer of whatever foolish hope she'd still been carrying. Not even my wife, or my partner, or any phrase that acknowledged her humanity. An asset. Something to be acquired, utilized, maintained at minimum cost. As dawnlight crept through her window, Elena made a decision. She would not cry, she would not confront, she would not leave. She would do something far more devastating. She would stay. and let him discover exactly what he'd dismissed as incidental. When the sun rose fully, Elena got out of bed, dressed carefully, and went downstairs to begin her day exactly as she always did. The maid greeted her. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackridge. Shall I prepare your usual breakfast?" "Yes, please." "And Margaret?" "Ma'am?" "From now on, I'll be taking a more hands-off approach to household management. I trust you and the staff to handle things without my oversight. If you need anything, please coordinate directly with Mr. Blackridge's secretary." Margaret blinked, confused. "But ma'am, we rely on your—" "I have complete confidence in your capabilities," Elena said with a pleasant smile. "I've been too hands-on. Time to let you all do your jobs without interference." She had breakfast alone in the morning room, reading a book she didn't absorb a single word from. When Rowan came down an hour later, already dressed for business, she greeted him with the same polite distance she'd maintained for months. "Good morning." "Morning," he replied, not looking up from the telegram he was reading. "I'll be at the rail yard all day. Dinner with Senator Morrison tonight. Don't wait up." "Of course." He left without a backward glance. Elena set down her book and walked upstairs to her private sitting room, the one space in this massive house that was supposed to be hers. She sat at her writing desk and pulled out the household ledgers she'd been maintaining since their marriage. 8 months of detailed records. Every social connection she'd cultivated on his behalf, every dinner party she'd hosted to impress his investors, every thank you note she'd written to smooth business relationships, every introduction she'd facilitated, every conversation she'd steered, every crisis she'd quietly managed while he was too busy measuring profits to notice. The Wickshire investment, secured because Elena had befriended Thomas's wife at a charity luncheon and mentioned Rowan's expansion plans while complimenting her bracelet. The Morrison permits, expedited because Elena had sat next to the senator's daughter at a gallery opening and spent 2 hours genuinely interested in her passion for women's education, leading to a friendship that made Morrison view Rowan as family adjacent rather than just another petitioner. The labor dispute that nearly exploded into a newspaper scandal, diffused because Elena had personally visited the injured worker's wife, paid for medical care out of her own inheritance, and convinced the family that quiet compensation was better than public litigation. One after another, invisible threads she'd woven through Rowan's empire while he was too focused on his ledgers to see the web she'd built around him. Not because she loved him, she'd stopped that months ago. Because she'd believed, foolishly, that if she proved herself valuable enough, useful enough, indispensable enough, he might eventually see her as more than an acquisition. Just an asset. Elena closed the ledgers carefully. Then she opened the bottom drawer of her desk and placed them inside, locked it, and dropped the key in her jewelry box. She would not maintain his invisible empire anymore. Let him discover what happens when the asset stops performing. That afternoon, 3 small things happened that Rowan didn't notice. First, when his secretary sent a telegram to confirm dinner with Morrison, the senator's office responded with unexpected coolness. The senator's daughter had visited her mother that morning, mentioning she hadn't heard from dear Elena in weeks and hoped everything was all right. The senator's wife had mentioned this to her husband, who was now vaguely offended that the Blackridges seemed to be distancing themselves from his family. Second, Thomas Wickshire received a letter from his wife questioning whether they should really invest with that cold man who treats his lovely wife like furniture. She'd heard things at the gala, disturbing things. Was this really the kind of person they wanted to be in business with? Third, the household staff began making small mistakes. Margaret burned the breakfast eggs. The groundskeeper missed a section of the lawn. The evening fire wasn't lit on time. Nothing catastrophic, just the normal errors that happen when detailed oversight suddenly vanishes. Rowan noticed none of it. He spent that day at the rail yard solving a supply chain problem with his usual efficiency. Ate dinner with Morrison, who seemed slightly distant but still committed to the permits. Returned home late to find the house dark and quiet. Perfect. Exactly as it should be. He went to bed satisfied that his empire was running exactly according to plan. In her room, Elena stared at the ceiling again, her hands folded, her breathing steady. This wasn't revenge. Revenge was emotional, and she'd moved past emotion into something colder and more permanent. This was withdrawal. Let him have his assets, his systems, his perfectly calculated empire. She would no longer be part of the machinery that kept it running. And eventually, maybe in weeks, maybe in months, he would look up from his precious ledgers and realize that the foundation he'd been standing on wasn't his brilliant strategy. It was her. The woman he'd dismissed as incidental, the asset he'd never bothered to properly value. By then, it would be far too late. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the gala. Rowan was reviewing contracts in his study when his secretary, Herbert, knocked with unusual hesitation. "Sir, there's been a complication with the Wickshire investment." Rowan didn't look up from the papers. "What kind of complication?" "Mr. Wickshire has withdrawn his commitment, all of it. 200,000 in infrastructure bonds. He's requesting a full refund of his deposit." Now Rowan looked up. "On what grounds?" Herbert shifted his weight. "He didn't specify grounds, sir. Just sent a formal letter of withdrawal this morning. Very brief. Very final." "Get him on the telephone." "I tried, sir. His secretary says he's unavailable." Rowan set down his pen with deliberate care. Wickshire had been enthusiastic about the Western expansion for months. 200,000 wasn't catastrophic, but it was significant, and more importantly, Wickshire's involvement had been attracting other Philadelphia investors. His withdrawal would create ripples. "Send a telegram. Tell him I'll come to Philadelphia personally to discuss whatever concerns he has." "Already sent, sir. No response yet." "Then we wait. He's probably posturing for better terms. Men like Wickshire don't walk away from solid returns without negotiation." But even as he said it, something nagged at Rowan's mind. The timing felt off. The abruptness felt wrong. In his experience, investors who wanted better terms made noise. They complained, they demanded meetings, they leveraged their dissatisfaction into concessions. They didn't just disappear. He pushed the thought aside and returned to his contracts. Problems were just equations waiting to be solved. 2 days later, Senator Morrison's office sent a terse message denying Rowan's expansion permits. No explanation, no opening for appeal, just a flat denial of applications that Morrison had practically guaranteed would sail through committee. Rowan read the telegram 3 times, his jaw tightening with each pass. "Herbert, get me a meeting with Morrison. Today, if possible." "I'll try, sir, but..." "No buts. Tell his office it's urgent. Tell them I'm prepared to discuss additional considerations for his next campaign." Herbert returned an hour later looking like a man who'd been asked to deliver his own death sentence. "The senator's office says he's unavailable for the foreseeable future. They suggested you submit your applications through normal channels and await standard review." "Standard review takes 18 months. "Yes, sir." Rowan stood abruptly, pacing to the window. His western expansion depended on those permits. Without them, he'd have to reroute through territories controlled by competitors, adding months to the timeline and bleeding money at every delay. What the hell happened? 2 weeks ago, Morrison was ready to fast-track everything. Herbert said nothing, which was answer enough. He didn't know. Nobody knew. The senator had simply frozen Rowan out without explanation or warning. That evening, Rowan came home to find the house in subtle disarray. Nothing dramatic, just small failures that accumulated into annoyance. Dinner was served cold. His study fire hadn't been lit. The mail sat unopened on a table in the hallway instead of sorted on his desk. He found Margaret in the kitchen, looking flustered. "What's going on with the staff? Everything's falling apart." Margaret twisted her apron. "We're doing our best, sir, but without Mrs. Blackridge's oversight." "What oversight?" "She doesn't do anything except read in the library." "Sir, respectfully, Mrs. Blackridge managed every detail of this household. The schedules, the budgets, the coordination between staff. Since she stopped, we've been trying to keep up. But there are things we don't know how to—" "Figure it out," Rowan interrupted. "You're paid to manage a household. Manage it." He left Margaret stammering an apology and went to find Elena. She was in the library, as predicted, sitting in a chair by the window with a book in her lap. She looked up when he entered, her expression pleasant and utterly neutral. "The house is a mess," he said without preamble. "The staff seems incapable of basic tasks without constant supervision. I've given them more autonomy. I thought it would be good for their professional development. Their professional development is making my life inconvenient. I'm sorry you feel that way." Her tone was perfectly polite, perfectly empty. "Perhaps you should speak with them directly about your expectations." "I'm speaking to you. You're supposed to manage these things. Am I? She tilted her head slightly, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes. Something sharp and cold that disappeared so quickly, Rowan thought he'd imagined it. I was under the impression that household management was incidental to my primary function as a strategic asset. Surely assets don't manage staffing concerns. The words landed like ice water. Rowan stared at her, his mind racing to catch up. What are you talking about? Nothing important. Elena returned to her book. I'll speak with Margaret about the dinner service. Will there be anything else? Rowan wanted to push further, but he didn't have time for domestic drama. He had real problems to solve. Disappearing investors, blocked permits, an expansion timeline bleeding delays. Just handle it, he said, and left. Behind him, Elena turned a page she hadn't read, her hands perfectly steady. The following week brought 3 more disasters in rapid succession. First, the Hartford Extension project ground to a complete halt when the primary contractor abruptly terminated his agreement, citing philosophical differences with management practices. Rowan had worked with Marcus Brennan for 5 years without a single philosophical discussion. Now suddenly the man had principles? Second, a scheduled meeting with the Industrial Commerce Board, a routine formality for his shipping contracts, turned into an interrogation about worker safety conditions. Where had this concern come from? His safety record was no worse than any other railway, better than most. Yet the board members treated him like he was running death camps instead of transportation infrastructure. Third, and most bewildering, an invitation to the governor's autumn reception arrived with Elena's name on it, but not his. The governor's secretary claimed it was a clerical error when Herbert inquired, but Rowan knew better. In politics, there were no clerical errors, only deliberate messages delivered through plausible deniability. He was being frozen out, systematically, by people who'd been courting his business and friendship for years. Rowan spent a long evening in his study with a bottle of whiskey, reviewing every recent interaction, every deal, every conversation, searching for the variable he'd missed. What had changed? The gala. Something at the gala. But he'd worked that room perfectly, made all the right connections, said all the right things to all the right people. A memory surfaced, Wickshire's expression shifting mid-conversation, his eyes darting past Rowan's shoulder. Morrison's wife whispering urgently to the governor's wife. A ripple of awareness spreading through the ballroom that Rowan had been too focused to notice. Elena setting down her champagne glass. Elena excusing herself to the powder room. Elena's face when she returned, perfectly composed, perfectly pleasant, perfectly empty. Just an asset. The words echoed in his memory, and for the first time, genuine unease crawled up his spine. She'd heard him. She'd been standing right there, and he'd reduced their marriage to a transaction in front of half the city's power structure. And she'd done what exactly? Cried? Made a scene? Left him? No. She'd done something far more subtle and far more devastating. She'd withdrawn. Rowan stood abruptly, pacing his study like a caged animal. No. That was ridiculous. Elena didn't have that kind of power. She was just a woman who read books and tended gardens. She didn't control his investors or political connections. She didn't manage anything important. Did she? He tried to remember the last time he'd actually noticed what Elena did with her time. Hosting dinner parties, presumably. Attending social functions. Making small talk with other wives while the men discussed real business. Except, the Wickshire investment had materialized after a dinner party Elena hosted. Morrison's sudden enthusiasm for the permits had followed some charity event Elena dragged him to. Brennan's contract extension had been signed the week after Elena had personally thanked the man's wife for some garden advice. Coincidences. Had to be. But the unease wouldn't leave, and Rowan didn't believe in coincidences. Everything was cause and effect, action and consequence. He'd just been looking at the wrong variables. The next morning, he made a decision he'd never made before. He sought out his wife. Elena was in the morning room writing correspondence at a small desk by the window. She looked up when he entered, that same pleasant neutrality on her face. "Good morning." "Morning." Rowan remained standing, suddenly unsure how to begin. "I wanted to discuss the household situation." "Of course. What would you like to discuss?" "Things have been disorganized lately. The staff seems confused about their responsibilities. I've given them more independence, as I mentioned. Yes, but he paused, choosing words carefully. Perhaps that was premature. Your oversight was clearly more valuable than I realized. Valuable? Elena set down her pen. That's an interesting choice of word. How exactly do you quantify the value of household management? Is there a ledger entry, a line item in your budgets? Her tone was still polite, but something underneath it made Rowan's jaw tighten. I'm acknowledging that things ran more smoothly when you were handling them. Things. Yes. Things tend to run smoothly when someone pays attention to them. She folded her hands in her lap. I've decided to focus my attention elsewhere. The household staff are competent professionals. I'm sure they'll adjust. Elena, is there something specific you need, Rowan? I have several letters to write this morning. He wanted to push, to demand explanations, to ask what the hell had changed between them. But the woman sitting in front of him felt like a stranger. Not angry, not hurt, just absent. Present physically, but gone in every way that mattered. No, he said finally. Nothing specific. She returned to her letters without another word. Rowan left feeling like he'd lost an argument he didn't know he was having. The disasters accelerated. A labor organizer named Samuel Brennan, no relation to the contractor, started showing up at Rowan's work sites, talking to the rail workers about safety conditions and fair wages. Normally, this would be a minor annoyance, easily handled by firing the ringleaders and hiring replacements. But when Rowan's foreman tried that approach, they discovered something alarming. The workers weren't scattering, they were organizing. They've got a list of demands, his chief foreman reported, looking nervous. Safety equipment, reduced hours, increased wages. They're threatening to strike if we don't negotiate. Then fire them and hire new crews. Sir, they've already got replacement workers agreeing not to cross picket lines. Samuel Brennan's been to every work site in the territory. He's got them unified. Rowan felt control slipping through his fingers like water through a sieve. This wasn't how things worked. Workers didn't unify. They competed for jobs, undercut each other for wages, scattered at the first sign of trouble. They didn't organize sophisticated resistance movements with coordinated demands, unless someone was helping them organize. Who's funding Brennan? The foreman shrugged helplessly. No idea, sir. But he's got resources. Printed pamphlets, legal advice, coordination across multiple sites. This isn't some spontaneous worker uprising. That evening, Rowan did something he hadn't done in months. He actually looked at Elena during dinner. She sat across from him in the formal dining room, eating her soup with perfect manners, her posture flawless, her expression serene. She looked like a portrait of a wealthy man's wife, beautiful, composed, utterly decorative. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at camouflage instead of the real thing. I attended a charity luncheon today, she said, breaking the silence. The Women's Education Fund. Very inspiring work. I'm sure. They're expanding their programs to working-class families, teaching literacy, basic mathematics, legal rights. The organizer mentioned they're also doing outreach to factory workers and rail laborers. Rowan's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. How philanthropic. I thought so. I made a donation from my personal funds. The work they're doing seems quite important. Their eyes met across the table. Hers were calm, almost innocent. His were searching, calculating, trying to see beneath the pleasant surface to whatever was actually happening. How large a donation? I didn't realize I needed your permission to spend my own inheritance. I didn't say you did. Good, because I'd hate to think you were monitoring my strategic deployment of personal assets. The slightest emphasis on those last words. So subtle, he might have imagined it. Rowan set down his fork, his appetite gone. What are you doing, Elena? Eating dinner. Is that not allowed? That's not what I mean. Then I'm afraid I don't understand the question. She dabbed her mouth with her napkin. Is there something specific you'd like to ask me? Yes. Are you sabotaging my business? Are you funding my enemies? Are you dismantling everything I've built because I called you an asset at a party? But he couldn't ask any of that without sounding paranoid, without admitting he suspected his decorative, impractical wife of orchestrating sophisticated economic warfare. It was absurd, except it wasn't. Not anymore. Never mind, he said. Elena smiled. If you'll excuse me, I have correspondence to finish. She left him alone in the dining room, and Rowan sat in silence, staring at his cooling food, feeling the ground shift beneath him in ways he couldn't quantify or measure. The next week, Thomas Wickshire's wife published an editorial in the Philadelphia Inquirer. The piece was ostensibly about the moral responsibilities of industrial investment, but anyone with half a brain could read between the lines. She didn't name Rowan directly, but she described in vivid, damning detail the kind of man who built empires on the backs of exploited workers while treating his own wife like property. She talked about dinner parties where she'd watched marriages reduced to business transactions, where women were discussed like furniture, where sentiment was mocked as weakness. The Industrial Commerce Board read it. So did the governor. So did every investor and politician who'd been doing business with Rowan for years. And suddenly the whispers that had been following him since the gala crystallized into something much worse than gossip. Judgment. Rowan's office started receiving cancellations. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious. Just a slow, steady withdrawal of support. Meetings postponed indefinitely. Contracts delayed pending review. Invitations politely declined. He was being blacklisted. Not officially, not publicly, but effectively. The invisible networks of power and influence that he'd spent years building were unraveling thread by thread. And sitting at the center of it all, like a spider he'd never noticed in her web, was his wife. He confronted her one evening in her sitting room. No pretense of civility this time, just direct confrontation. "You're destroying my business." Elena looked up from the book she was reading, her expression mildly curious. "Am I? How?" "Don't play innocent. The donations, the charity work, the social connections you've been cultivating, you're using them against me. I'm using my personal time and money to support causes I believe in. If that somehow conflicts with your business interests, perhaps you should examine your business practices. This is revenge." "For what?" She set down her book, meeting his eyes with that same devastating calm. "You made yourself perfectly clear at the gala. I'm just an asset. Assets don't have feelings to hurt. Assets don't seek revenge. We simply perform our designated functions, or we don't. You heard me." "I did." "And instead of talking to me about it like a reasonable person, you decided to sabotage everything I've built?" "I haven't sabotaged anything, Rowan. I've simply stopped performing unpaid labor on behalf of your empire." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "Every dinner party I hosted that secured your investments, my time, my effort, every connection I cultivated that opened political doors, my social capital, every crisis I quietly managed that never reached your precious ledgers, my problem solving. You assumed all of that was incidental, part of the furniture, free value that came with the strategic asset you acquired. So this is about money?" She laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut. "No, Rowan. This is about the fact that you married me, lived with me for 8 months, benefited from my work every single day, and never once bothered to notice I was doing it. You were so busy measuring profits and calculating angles that you never saw the actual foundation your empire was built on." "That's absurd. My empire is built on infrastructure, capital investment, and strategic planning." "Is it?" Elena moved to her desk, pulled out a ledger, and dropped it on the table between them with a heavy thud. "This is 8 months of household records. Every social connection, every strategic introduction, every investor relationship I facilitated. Read it, then tell me how incidental I was." Rowan stared at the ledger like it might explode. "You kept records?" "I'm not just decorative, despite what you assumed. I was educated in Paris, remember? Economics, philosophy, literature. I know how systems work. I know how power moves. I just happened to be moving it in your direction until you made it very clear that my contributions were worthless." "I never said worthless. You said incidental. You said irrelevant. You reduced me to acceptable social graces and useful connections, as if those things manifest from nowhere instead of requiring intelligence, effort, and strategy." She stepped closer, and for the first time since the gala, real emotion cracked through her composure. "You didn't marry a piece of land, Rowan. You married a woman, a complete, thinking, feeling human being who was foolish enough to believe that if she proved herself valuable enough, you might eventually see her as something more than a transaction." The silence that followed was suffocating. Rowan's mind raced, trying to process information that didn't fit his carefully constructed worldview. Elena wasn't supposed to be strategic. She was supposed to be impractical, sentimental, useful but unimportant. The idea that she'd been running invisible operations sophisticated enough to prop up his business empire, and now dismantle it, was like being told that gravity worked sideways. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Nothing. Everyone wants something. Not from you." Elena picked up the ledger, returned it to her desk drawer. "I wanted a partner, someone who saw me, respected me, valued me beyond my utility. But you can't give me those things because you don't believe they exist. Everything's just transactions to you. Assets and liabilities, profit and loss. That's how the world works." "No, Rowan, that's how your world works. And you're welcome to it." She moved toward the door. "I'm done subsidizing your empire with invisible labor. I'm done pretending I don't exist beyond what you bothered to measure. You wanted a strategic asset? Fine. But assets don't perform beyond their contracted specifications. And our contract was very specific. Land for security. You got your land. I got my security. Everything else I gave you was free value you never appreciated and no longer deserve." She left him standing in her sitting room, surrounded by books and furniture, and the ghost of a woman he'd never bothered to know. Rowan stood there for a long time, feeling something he hadn't felt since his father's business collapsed around them. Complete, bewildering loss of control. The strike started 3 days later. Every railway worker on Rowan's eastern lines walked off the job simultaneously. Not scattered protests or isolated work stoppages. A coordinated, sophisticated strike that shut down operations completely. Samuel Brennan stood at the front of the picket lines with printed demands, legal representation, and enough public support to make violent suppression politically impossible. And when Rowan's investigators finally tracked down the funding source for the workers' organization, they found something that made his blood run cold. The money had come from a women's education fund charity, a charity that had recently received a substantial anonymous donation from a private trust established in Paris 20 years ago, in Elena Viermont's name. Rowan sat in his study that evening, staring at the investigator's report, feeling his empire crack beneath him like ice on a warming river. His wife had been playing chess while he'd been counting coins, and he hadn't seen it coming until she'd already won. The strike entered its second week with no sign of breaking. Rowan stood at his office window, watching the empty rail yard stretch into the distance like a graveyard of steel and ambition. 200 workers had walked off the job. His shipping contracts were bleeding penalties at a rate that made his accountant physically ill. His western expansion had ground to a complete halt, and somewhere in his own house, his wife was quietly watching his empire collapse like a controlled demolition. Herbert entered without knocking, which meant the news was bad. "The Hartford investors are pulling out. All of them. They're citing the labor situation as too unstable for their risk tolerance." Rowan didn't turn from the window. "How much?" 400,000, plus the loss of the Hartford route itself. They're selling to Garrison Rail. That made Rowan turn. Garrison? Those incompetent bastards couldn't run a profitable line if someone handed them a map. They're offering the workers a 20% wage increase and new safety equipment. The investors think that's more sustainable than fighting a prolonged strike. It's capitulation. Once you give in to worker demands, they never stop demanding. Sir, with respect, maybe that's the point. Maybe the workers have legitimate grievances. Rowan stared at his secretary like the man had suggested they abandon trains for covered wagons. "Since when do you have opinions about labor relations?" Herbert's face flushed. "Since I started seeing the casualty reports you've been ignoring. 3 men dead this year on your rail lines. 12 injured badly enough to lose work permanently. That's not business cost, sir. That's human cost. Men know the risks when they sign on. I don't force anyone to work for me. No, you just make sure they're desperate enough that they don't have better options." Herbert's voice was shaking now, years of silent resentment finally breaking through. "You want to know why Wickshire pulled his investment? Because his wife showed him the numbers. The real numbers. Not your sanitized quarterly reports, but actual data on worker mortality, injury rates, families left destitute because you won't pay for basic safety equipment. She got those numbers from Mrs. Blackridge." The room went very quiet. What did you say? Mrs. Blackridge has been collecting documentation for months, sir. Every accident report you buried, every safety complaint you ignored, every family you paid off to avoid lawsuits. She's been sharing that information with investors' wives, with charity organizations, with newspaper editors. You didn't just dismiss your wife at a party. You dismissed the one person who knew where all the bodies were buried. Rowan felt something cold settle in his chest. You're fired. I quit 3 days ago. I just stayed long enough to tell you to your face what everyone else has been too afraid to say. Herbert pulled off his reading glasses, set them on the desk with exaggerated care. You're brilliant at building empires, sir. But you're terrible at seeing people. And eventually, that catches up with you. He walked out, leaving Rowan alone in an office that suddenly felt cavernous and empty. For the first time in his adult life, Rowan Blackridge didn't know what to do. Every problem he'd ever faced had been solvable through calculation. Market downturns, diversify assets, competitor aggression, undercut pricing, regulatory obstacles, buy political influence. Everything was just another variable in the equation, but this wasn't a normal problem. This was something far more dangerous, a moral reckoning delivered through economic warfare by a woman who understood his systems better than he'd understood her. He went home early that evening, something he never did. Found Elena in the garden, wearing gloves and pruning roses like the world wasn't burning down around them. We need to talk. She didn't look up. About what? You know what? The strike, the investors, the documentation you've been distributing. I haven't distributed anything. She snipped a dead bloom, dropped it in a basket. I've simply answered questions honestly when people asked. If your business practices can't survive honest disclosure, that seems like your problem, not mine. This is sabotage. No, Rowan. Sabotage implies I'm lying or manipulating information. I'm just making visible what you kept invisible. She finally looked at him, her eyes calm but hard. Those accident reports? Accurate. The casualty numbers? Straight from your own foreman's records. The financial calculations showing you could afford safety equipment but chose not to? Basic mathematics. I haven't sabotaged anything. I've just stopped helping you hide. You're destroying me. I'm holding up a mirror. If you don't like what you see, maybe you should have built something different. Rowan felt rage and desperation warring in his chest. What do you want? Name your price, whatever it takes to end this. Elena set down her pruning shears, pulled off her gloves slowly, deliberately. You still don't understand. There is no price. I don't want your money or your compromise or your strategic concessions. I wanted you to see me as a human being instead of an acquisition. But you can't. It's not in you. So now I'm simply stepping back and letting you experience the natural consequences of treating people like assets instead of partners. The workers have legitimate grievances that you ignored until they cost you money. But even now, you're not asking how to fix the actual problems. You're asking how to make me stop embarrassing you about them. I'll meet their demands. 20% wage increase, safety equipment, everything they're asking. Will you? Elena tilted her head, studying him like a specimen. Or will you make the minimum concessions necessary to restart operations, then gradually claw everything back through contract technicalities and budget cuts? Because that's what you do, Rowan. You optimize, you minimize costs. You treat every negotiation as a zero-sum game where someone has to lose. Business is a zero-sum game. Life isn't. She picked up her basket of dead roses. But you'll never believe that. So we're done here. She walked past him toward the house, and Rowan felt something crack inside him, not his pride or his control, but something deeper and more fundamental. I didn't know, he said, and his voice came out rougher than intended. About the accidents, the real numbers. I knew there were incidents, but I didn't know. Elena stopped, her back still to him. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. She turned slightly, enough that he could see her profile. You built systems specifically designed to keep that information from reaching you. Layers of foremen and supervisors and report summaries that filtered out anything uncomfortable. You didn't accidentally overlook those deaths, Rowan. You constructed an empire specifically designed to let you ignore them. The truth of it hit like a physical blow. What do I do? I don't know. That's your problem now. She continued toward the house, then paused at the door. But I'll tell you what you don't do. You don't come to me asking how to fix the consequences of your choices while refusing to change the thinking that created them. You either genuinely become a different man or you don't. But I'm done being the invisible force that makes you look better than you are. The door closed behind her, and Rowan stood alone in the garden, surrounded by roses she'd cultivated and maintained while he'd been too busy measuring profits to notice beauty. The next morning, Samuel Brennan showed up at Rowan's office with a delegation of workers. Rowan's new temporary secretary, a nervous young man named Peter who clearly wished he was anywhere else, announced them with visible terror. "Sir, the strike leaders are here. They say they have a proposal." "Send them in." Brennan entered flanked by 4 rail workers, all of them carrying the kind of physical wear that came from years of hard labor. Missing fingers, burn scars. One man walked with a pronounced limp. They stood across the desk from Rowan like soldiers facing enemy territory. "Mr. Blackridge," Brennan said, "we appreciate you seeing us. I don't have much choice. You've shut down my operations." "You had choices. You just made the wrong ones." Brennan set a folder on the desk. "Here's our proposal. 25% wage increase, comprehensive safety equipment, 8-hour workdays instead of 12, and a workers' committee that reviews safety procedures monthly." Rowan opened the folder, scanned the numbers. "This would cost me less than the strike is costing you right now," Brennan interrupted. "We've done the math. With proper safety equipment, your injury rates drop. Your efficiency improves. Your workers don't die or quit from exhaustion. Long term, this saves you money while keeping us alive. Seems like a fair trade." "And if I refuse?" "Then we stay on strike until you go bankrupt or sell to someone willing to negotiate. Either way, we win. Question is whether you want to win with us or lose against us." One of the workers, the one with the limp, spoke up. "My brother died on your Hartford line. Fell from scaffolding that didn't have proper railings because purchasing them would have delayed the project 2 days. You paid my mother $500 to stay quiet. That was supposed to make it right." Rowan felt something cold in his stomach. "I'm sorry for your loss." "No, you're not. You're sorry it became public. There's a difference." The man's eyes were hard as coal. "But we're not here for apologies. We're here for change. Real change. You agree to these terms, put them in writing, submit to independent safety inspections. We'll go back to work. You refuse, and we'll make sure every worker in the Eastern Territories knows exactly what kind of man you are." Rowan looked at the 5 men standing in his office, looked at their scars, their exhaustion, their absolute unwillingness to back down. These weren't abstract variables in an efficiency equation. They were human beings who'd decided they'd rather risk everything than keep feeding themselves into his machinery. "I need time to review this." "You have 24 hours, Brennan said. "After that, we take our case to the newspapers. Mrs. Blackridge has been very helpful in making those connections." Of course she had. The workers left, and Rowan sat in silence, staring at the proposal. Every instinct screamed at him to fight this, to find replacement workers, to break the strike through attrition, to crush this rebellion before it spread to other companies. But a quieter voice, one he'd been ignoring for weeks, whispered that maybe Herbert had been right. Maybe Elena had been right. Maybe he'd built an empire on foundations that couldn't support the weight of human cost. He was still wrestling with that thought when Peter burst into the office, his face pale. "Sir, there's a situation at the Western Junction site." "What kind of situation?" "A protest. Hundreds of workers and their families. They're blocking the rail lines, preventing any scab labor from entering the site. And sir, Mrs. Blackridge is there." Rowan was on his feet instantly. "What?" "She arrived an hour ago, just walked into the crowd and started talking with the workers' wives. The foreman tried to get her to leave and she refused. Now the crowd's getting agitated and, sir, they're angry, really angry. The foreman's worried about violence." Rowan grabbed his coat, his mind racing. Elena in the middle of an angry mob of workers she'd been secretly supporting. The optics were catastrophic. But more than that, if things turned violent, he didn't let himself finish that thought. The carriage ride to the Western Junction felt endless. By the time Rowan arrived, the protest had swelled to what looked like 500 people. Workers, wives, children, all of them packed around the rail site entrance with signs and angry voices. And standing in the center of it all, wearing a simple gray dress like she was attending a garden party, was Elena. Rowan pushed through the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. People recognized him. He could see it in their faces. The anger that had been diffused suddenly focused like sunlight through a lens. That's him! Black Ridge! Murderer! The crowd surged closer, and Rowan felt genuine fear spike through him. These weren't abstract workers anymore. They were individual people with individual grievances, and their collective rage was palpable. "Elena!" he shouted over the noise. She turned, saw him, and her expression shifted to something he couldn't read. Not fear, not satisfaction. Something more complicated. She started moving toward him through the crowd, but the mob's energy was building. Someone threw a rock that missed Rowan by inches. Someone else shoved him hard enough that he stumbled. "You let our families starve. My husband lost his arm in your rail yard. You think you can buy your way out of this?" Elena was still trying to reach him, but the crowd had become a living thing, dangerous and unpredictable. Rowan saw a wooden board being raised, saw the murderous intent in the man's eyes, saw Elena directly in the path. He didn't think. Rowan lunged forward, grabbed Elena, and twisted his body to shield her as the board came down. The impact caught his shoulder instead of her head, sending white-hot pain shooting down his arm. He went down hard, Elena beneath him, the crowd pressing closer. "Stop!" Elena's voice cut through the chaos. "Stop it right now!" Something in her tone, command mixed with genuine distress, made the crowd hesitate. She struggled out from under Rowan, stood up, and faced the mob with fierce intensity. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But this?" She gestured at Rowan on the ground, blood seeping from a cut on his forehead where he'd hit the cobblestones. "This doesn't fix anything. Violence just gives him an excuse to bring in soldiers and crush you completely." "He deserves worse than a board to the head," someone shouted. "Maybe he does. But do your families deserve to watch you hang for murder? Because that's what happens when workers kill industrialists. They don't arrest one person, they arrest everyone." Elena's voice was shaking but steady. "I've been helping you because I believe you deserve better. Better wages, better safety, better treatment. But if this turns into a riot, you lose everything. The public turns against you. The politicians declare you criminals. And he wins by becoming a victim instead of a villain." The crowd wavered, the energy shifting from violent rage to uncertain confusion. "Then what do we do?" a woman called out. "Keep begging? Keep dying?" "No. You keep organizing, keep striking, keep making it impossible for him to operate until he meets your demands. You win through solidarity, not violence, through economic pressure, not blood." Elena's eyes swept the crowd. "I know it's not satisfying. I know you want immediate justice. But trust me, destroying him the right way takes longer, but it's permanent." A long, tense silence. Then someone in the crowd lowered their makeshift weapon. Then another. The violent energy didn't disappear, but it banked, redirected into something more controlled. Samuel Brennan pushed through to the front. "She's right. We walk away now. We keep our moral high ground. We stay united, stay on strike, and we win. We turn this into a bloodbath, and we've lost before the first body hits the ground." Slowly, grudgingly, the crowd began to disperse. Not happily, but with enough discipline that the immediate danger passed. Elena knelt beside Rowan, who was still on the ground, his shoulders screaming, his head ringing. "Can you stand?" "I think so." He struggled upright with her help, and the world tilted sickeningly. "You walked into an angry mob." "I was talking to them. They were listening until you showed up and turned their anger personal. They were about to kill you." "They were venting. There's a difference." But her hands were shaking as she examined his shoulder. "You're bleeding. We need to get you to a doctor." "Why did you come here?" Elena met his eyes, and for the first time since the gala, he saw something raw beneath her carefully maintained composure. "Because, despite everything, I didn't want this to end in violence. I wanted you to lose your empire, not your life. There's a difference." Samuel Brennan approached them cautiously. "Mr. Blackridge, Mrs. Blackridge, I suggest you both leave before the crowd changes its mind." "The proposal," Rowan said, and his voice came out rough. 24 hours. You'll have my answer. Respectfully, sir, given what just happened, I think we'd all prefer your answer sooner. Rowan looked at the dispersing crowd, at the faces of people who'd been willing to kill him minutes ago, at Elena, who'd risked her own safety to prevent that violence even after everything he'd done, at his empire, crumbling around him because he'd built it on a foundation of human cost he'd refused to see. I accept your terms, he said. Brennan blinked. Sir, all of them. 25% wage increase, safety equipment, 8-hour days, workers' committee. Put it in writing. I'll sign it tomorrow. He swayed slightly, and Elena steadied him. You were right. I've been treating people like assets instead of human beings. And it almost got my wife killed because she was trying to protect both sides from my mistakes. The crowd had gone silent, everyone within earshot straining to hear. You understand, Brennan said carefully. If you're saying this under duress, it won't hold. We need genuine commitment. I'm saying it because I just watched 500 people hate me enough to contemplate murder, and the only person who stepped between us was the woman I've been systematically dismissing as irrelevant for 8 months. Rowan's vision was starting to blur at the edges. I'm saying it because she's right. You're right. Herbert was right. Everyone was right except me. He felt his knees buckle, felt Elena's arms around him, felt the world tilt into darkness. The last thing he heard before passing out was Elena's voice, urgent and afraid in a way he'd never heard before. Get a doctor, now! When Rowan woke, he was in his own bed with bandages around his head and his shoulder immobilized in a sling. Sunlight streamed through windows, suggesting he'd lost at least a day. Elena sat in a chair beside the bed, reading. She looked exhausted, her dress wrinkled, her hair falling loose from its pins. You stayed, he said, and his voice came out like gravel. She looked up, and something flickered across her face. The doctor said someone should monitor you for signs of concussion. Don't read too much into it. How long was I out? 18 hours. You cracked 2 ribs when you fell, and you have a moderate concussion. The doctor says you'll recover, but you need rest. She set down her book. Samuel Brennan came by. He brought the contract. I told him you'd sign it when you were conscious enough to hold a pen. Rowan struggled to sit up, ignoring the protest from his ribs. I meant what I said about accepting the terms. I know you did, but you said it after being attacked by a mob and while barely conscious. That's not exactly a sound decision-making state. It was the clearest thinking I've done in months. He met her eyes. You walked into danger to protect people from me. After everything I did. After the gala. After dismissing you. After building an empire on foundations you tried to warn me about. I didn't do it for you. I know. You did it because you're a better person than I am. Because you actually see people instead of variables. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. You've been dismantling my empire piece by piece for weeks. You could have let that mob kill me and walked away with everything. Why didn't you? Elena was silent for a long moment. Because I didn't marry you to destroy you. I married you hoping you'd become someone worth loving. That hope died at the gala, but apparently some part of me still couldn't watch you die for real. She stood, smoothing her wrinkled dress. The doctor will be back this afternoon. Don't try to get up without help. Elena, get some rest, Rowan. We'll talk when you're not concussed. She left before he could find the words he needed. Words he'd never learned how to say because he'd spent his entire life believing sentiment was weakness. For 3 days, Rowan recovered in enforced stillness. The doctor had been clear, rest or risk permanent damage. So he stayed in bed, reading reports Peter brought him, signing documents, managing his collapsing empire from a prone position. Elena checked on him periodically but kept their interactions brief and clinical. She'd reverted to the distant politeness she'd maintained since the gala, and Rowan found himself missing even their confrontations. At least anger was a connection. This careful neutrality felt like erasure. On the 4th day, Samuel Brennan visited with the finalized contract. The workers have voted to accept your terms, pending your signature. Once you sign, we'll return to work within 48 hours. Rowan read through the document carefully. Every demand met. Every worker protection guaranteed. His profit margins would be tight for the first year, but Brennan had been right. Long term, this was sustainable. Better than sustainable. It was ethical. He signed his name with his left hand, his right shoulder still too damaged for precision. "There's one more thing," he said as Brennan prepared to leave. "The families of workers who died on my rail lines. I want a full accounting of every casualty in the past 5 years, and I want to provide real compensation. Not hush money, actual support, pensions for widows, education funds for children, medical care for the injured." Brennan stared at him. "That's going to cost you significantly." "I can afford it. Turns out I was spending more on lawyers to avoid responsibility than it would have cost to just take responsibility in the first place." Rowan met his eyes. "I can't bring back the dead, but I can make sure their families don't starve because I valued efficiency over human life." This is a substantial change from the man who told his workers that hazard wages covered their risks. That man almost got killed by his own workers and had to be saved by his wife. I'd like to be a different man, if possible. Brennan extended his hand. "Then welcome to the difficult work of actually giving a damn about people, Mr. Blackridge. It's expensive and inconvenient, but you sleep better." After Brennan left, Rowan sat in bed, staring at the signed contract. He just voluntarily reduced his profit margins, committed to expensive safety measures, and guaranteed ongoing worker oversight of his operations. By every measure that had guided his life until now, he'd lost. But for the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was standing on crumbling ground. That evening, Elena came to check on him and found him trying, unsuccessfully, to put on a shirt with one functional arm. "What are you doing?" "Getting dressed. I need to go to my office." "The doctor said bed rest for another week." "I'll rest in my office chair instead of my bed. The work doesn't stop because I'm injured." Elena crossed her arms. "What work exactly? You've met the workers' demands. Your investors have mostly abandoned you. Your expansion is on indefinite hold. What urgent business requires you to risk permanent shoulder damage?" "I need to restructure everything, the whole company, not just meeting the immediate demands, but fundamentally changing how we operate. That doesn't happen from bed. It also doesn't happen if you collapse from pushing yourself too hard while concussed." They stared at each other across the bedroom. The first real conversation they'd had in days that wasn't about medical care or basic logistics. "Why do you care?" Rowan asked finally. "Whether I rest or work myself to death. After everything that's happened, why does it matter to you?" Elena's expression shifted, something raw showing through before she locked it down again. "I don't know. It shouldn't, but apparently 8 months of marriage creates habits that don't disappear just because they should." She moved closer, and before he could process what was happening, she was helping him with his shirt with efficient, impersonal movements. "There. Now sit down before you fall down." Rowan sat, and Elena stepped back, maintaining careful distance. "I'm going to dissolve our marriage contract," he said. Her face went very still. "What?" "You were right, everything you said. I married you for land and dismissed you as incidental. That was unconscionable. You deserve better than being trapped in a transaction with someone who couldn't see your value." He pulled a folded document from his nightstand with his good hand. "I had my lawyer draw this up. Full dissolution. You get the estate, your full inheritance back, and an additional settlement that reflects the value you brought to my business. No conditions, no negotiations. You're free." Elena took the document with trembling hands, read it in silence. "This is... Rowan, this is everything. You're giving me back everything I brought to the marriage plus half your liquid assets. It's what you earned, what you should have been valued at all along. But you'll be nearly bankrupt. I'll rebuild. I did it once, I can do it again. But I won't rebuild on your unpaid labor and invisible support." He met her eyes. "I can't give you back the 8 months I wasted. I can't undo the gala or make you unhear what I said. But I can at least end this transaction on terms that actually reflect your worth instead of my blindness." Elena stared at the document for a long time. Then, very deliberately, she tore it in half. Rowan felt his heart stop. "What are you doing?" "I don't want a divorce settlement that reflects my economic contribution. I don't want you buying your way out of guilt with generous payments." She dropped the torn papers on his lap. "If you want to dissolve this marriage, fine. But not like this. Not with you quantifying my value in dollar amounts and calling it respect. Then what do you want?" Nothing you can give me right now. She moved toward the door, then stopped. But if you actually want to become a different man, not because a mob attacked you, or because your empire collapsed, but because you genuinely want to see people instead of assets, then start over. Not with contracts or settlements or strategic concessions, just start over as a human being instead of a calculation machine. She left him holding torn papers and a truth he'd been avoiding for months. He didn't know how to be the man she deserved. Didn't know if he was even capable of it. But for the first time in his life, Rowan Blackridge wanted to learn. Rowan spent the next morning doing something he'd never done in his adult life. He went to the rail yard not as an owner, but as an observer. His shoulder was still strapped, his ribs ached with every breath, but he needed to see what he'd been too focused on profits to notice. The workers had returned after the contract signing, and the yard hummed with cautious activity. Men moved with the practiced efficiency of people who knew their jobs, but there was wariness in their movements, glances thrown toward the main office like they expected the other shoe to drop. Rowan stood at the edge of the work site, watching a crew install new safety railings on the elevated platforms. The equipment had arrived 2 days ago, ordered, he'd discovered, by Elena 3 weeks before the strike even started. She'd anticipated his capitulation before he'd known it was inevitable. "Mr. Blackridge." He turned to find Samuel Brennan approaching with 2 other men. One was the worker whose brother had died on the Hartford line. The other was missing 3 fingers on his left hand. "Brennan, I didn't expect to see you here." "Workers' committee. We're doing safety inspections now, remember?" Brennan gestured to the new railings. "These are good. Properly installed, regulation height. Your foreman's actually following the specifications instead of cutting corners." "Because I told him anyone caught skimping on safety equipment would be fired immediately." The worker with missing fingers snorted. "Easy to say, harder to enforce when deadlines squeeze." "Then we miss deadlines," Rowan said. "I'm restructuring the entire contract system. No more penalty clauses that incentivize cutting safety corners. Projects finish when they finish safely." "That'll cost you clients." "Then they weren't clients worth having." Rowan met the man's skeptical gaze. "I know you don't believe me. I wouldn't believe me either. But watch. The first foreman who tries to skip safety protocols to meet a deadline gets terminated. No warnings, no second chances. I'm done building an empire on dead workers." Brennan studied him for a long moment. "You know what's strange? I actually think you mean that." "I do. Question is whether you'll still mean it in 6 months when the financial pressure builds and the easy path starts looking tempting again." "That's fair." Rowan shifted his weight, his shoulder throbbing. "I don't expect you to trust me based on words. Judge me on actions. That's what I'm doing now, trying to figure out what right actions look like when you've spent 15 years doing everything wrong." The man whose brother had died spoke up, his voice rough. "My mother got a letter yesterday from your office. Said you're setting up an education fund for workers' children, putting $5,000 in for families who lost someone on your rail lines. 10,000, actually. 5 for education, 5 for general family support. It should have been done years ago." "Why now? Because you got hit with a board and suddenly found your conscience?" Rowan wanted to deflect, to make himself look better. But Elena's words echoed in his head. Start over as a human being instead of a calculation machine. "Because my wife spent 8 months trying to show me that people mattered, and I dismissed her as irrelevant. Then she systematically dismantled my empire to prove I'd been standing on foundations I didn't build and couldn't see. And when I finally looked, really looked, I realized I'd constructed an entire business designed to let me ignore human suffering so I could pretend efficiency was the same as morality." He paused. "Your brother died because I valued 2 days of schedule over basic safety equipment. That's not a business decision. That's moral bankruptcy. And I'm trying, badly, probably, to become someone who doesn't make those calculations anymore." The 3 men exchanged glances. "That's a pretty speech," Brennan said carefully. "It's not a speech. It's a confession." Rowan looked at the rail yard, at the workers moving with new safety harnesses and proper equipment. "I don't know if I can actually change. I've spent my whole life believing sentiment was weakness and that reducing everything to transactions made me wise. Unlearning that is harder than I thought it would be, but I'm trying." The man with missing fingers extended his right hand. the one with all 5 digits intact. Then I'll try to believe you might succeed. That's about as much as we can give each other right now. Rowan shook his hand, feeling the calluses earned through years of hard labor he'd never properly valued. After the workers left, Rowan stood alone in the rail yard for a long time, watching men build the infrastructure he'd designed but never truly seen. Every beam placed, every rail secured, every safety check performed, all of it done by human beings whose names he didn't know and whose lives he'd treated as acceptable losses in pursuit of progress. He was still standing there when Peter found him. "Sir, there's someone here to see you, Thomas Wickshire." Rowan's stomach tightened. Did he say what he wants? No, sir. But he seemed less hostile than expected. Wickshire was waiting in Rowan's office, the one at the rail yard, not the grand space downtown. It was smaller, more utilitarian, and currently covered in safety regulation manuals and workers' committee reports. The Philadelphia investor stood by the window, looking at the rail yard below. He turned when Rowan entered, and his expression was complicated. "Blackridge, you look terrible." "Cracked ribs and a concussion will do that." Rowan gestured to a chair with his good arm. "Have a seat. I assume this isn't a social call." Wickshire sat, looking uncomfortable. "I heard about the strike resolution, about you accepting the workers' terms without negotiation." Word travels fast. "In our circles? Everything travels fast." Wickshire pulled out a folded newspaper. "Have you seen this?" It was the Philadelphia Inquirer. The headline read, "Industrial Magnate Blackridge Accepts Worker Demands, Pledges Safety Reform." Below it, a smaller headline, "Wife's Intervention Prevents Violent Confrontation at Rail Yard." Rowan read the article in silence. It was surprisingly balanced, acknowledging his past failures while noting the contract signing and the family compensation fund. There was a quote from Samuel Brennan calling the agreement unprecedented in scope and genuine in intent. And a quote from Elena, "My husband is learning that empire building means nothing if it's built on human cost. I believe he's capable of becoming the man his workers deserve. Time will tell if that belief is justified." Rowan set down the paper, his throat tight. "My wife read this article," Wickshire said quietly, 3 times. Then she came to my office and told me she might have been too harsh in her initial assessment of you. She wasn't. Maybe not. But she pointed out that a man who admits his failures and works to correct them is different from a man who denies them entirely. Wickshire leaned forward. "I didn't pull my investment because of your business practices, Blackridge. I pulled it because my wife was horrified by how you treated yours. She couldn't sleep knowing our money was supporting a man who dismissed his own wife as a strategic asset. I deserved her horror." "Yes, you did. But she's also a believer in redemption, and she says your wife wouldn't be giving you a chance unless she saw something worth salvaging." Wickshire pulled out another document. "So I'm here with a conditional offer. I'll reinvest, not the full $200,000, but $50 to start, contingent on quarterly safety audits by an independent inspector and demonstrated compliance with the new worker contracts." Rowan stared at the offer. "You'd trust me again?" "I'd trust your wife's judgment, and I'd trust that a man who nearly got killed protecting her might actually be learning something." Wickshire stood. "But understand, this is probationary. One safety violation, one attempt to undermine the worker agreements, and I pull out permanently. This is your chance to prove you meant what you said. Don't waste it." After Wickshire left, Rowan sat alone in his office, holding the investment offer and the newspaper article. Elena's quote stared up at him. "I believe he's capable of becoming the man his workers deserve." She'd defended him publicly, given him credit he hadn't earned yet, kept a door open that he'd thought she'd slammed shut forever. Why? He found her that evening in her sitting room, writing correspondence as always. She looked up when he knocked, and her expression shifted to concern when she saw his face. "You should be resting." The doctor said, "I read your quote in the Inquirer." She set down her pen carefully. "I was trying to give the workers confidence that the agreement would hold. It wasn't about you." "Wasn't it?" Rowan moved into the room, his ribs protesting every step. "You could have told them I'm a monster learning basic decency out of necessity. You could have said you hope I follow through but expect me to fail. Instead, you said you believe I'm capable of becoming better." I said time will tell if that belief is justified. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. It's more than I deserve, especially after... He trailed off, struggling for words. Why did you tear up the dissolution papers? Elena was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her desk. Because watching you try to buy your way out of guilt with generous settlements was exactly the same mistake you've been making all along. You can't fix human relationships with transactions. You can't quantify respect in dollar amounts. She met his eyes. If you want to end this marriage, we can, but not through contracts and calculated compensations. We either part as two people who tried and failed, or we don't part at all. There's no middle ground where you pay me enough to make everything okay. What if I don't want to part? Then you have to actually do the work of becoming someone I'd want to stay married to, not someone who performs goodness to keep access to my social connections or my land, someone who genuinely sees other people as more than strategic assets. She stood, moving to the window. And I don't know if you're capable of that, Rowan. I want to believe you are. But belief and reality don't always align. Teach me. She turned, surprise flickering across her face. What? You said I need to start over as a human being. I don't know how to do that. I spent my entire life building walls between myself and emotional vulnerability because I watched my father fall apart when my mother died. I learned that caring too much made you weak, that love was dangerous, that reducing everything to transactions kept you safe. His voice roughened. But it didn't keep me safe. It just made me into someone who couldn't see the woman standing right beside him, someone who built an empire on suffering and called it success. Elena's expression shifted, something cracking in her careful composure. I can't teach you how to be human, Rowan. That has to come from you. Then tell me what you need. What would make you consider giving me a real chance instead of just watching to see if I fail? She laughed, but it came out broken. That's the problem. You're still trying to solve this like an equation. Tell me what you need so I can provide it and achieve the desired outcome. But relationships don't work that way. I can't give you a checklist that results in my love. You either become someone worth loving or you don't. Then tell me about yourself. Not what you need from me, but who you are. Because I realized I've lived with you for 8 months and I don't know your favorite color or what you studied in Paris or why you came back when your mother died. I don't know anything except that you're brilliant and strategic and far better than I deserve. Elena stared at him for a long moment. Then she returned to her chair, settled in with the careful posture of someone preparing for an interrogation. My favorite color is dark green, the color of forests in early morning when the light's just starting to break through. I studied economics and philosophy in Paris because I wanted to understand how societies function and how they fail. I came back when my mother died because my father was falling apart, and I couldn't let him lose everything the way yours did. She paused. I grew up watching my parents love each other desperately and completely. They had what people call a great romance, and when my mother got sick, my father spent every penny we had trying to save her. He bankrupted our estate buying treatments that didn't work and doctors who couldn't help. When she died anyway, he was left with nothing but debt and grief. That's why you agreed to marry me, Rowan said slowly. You needed someone who could save your father's estate. Partially, but also because I thought a man who didn't love me couldn't hurt me the way my father hurt when he lost my mother. I thought a transaction marriage would be safer, less painful. She met his eyes. I was wrong. Being dismissed as irrelevant by someone who never loved me hurt more than I expected. At least my father had love before he lost it. I just had an acquisition contract. The truth of it sat between them, heavy and undeniable. I'm sorry, Rowan said, and the words felt inadequate. That's not enough. Nothing I say is enough, but I am genuinely, desperately sorry. I know you are. That's what makes this so hard. Elena's voice cracked slightly. It would be easier if you were just a monster, if you'd stayed the cold, calculating man who dismissed me at the gala. But you're trying to be better, and that means I have to decide whether to believe in your capacity for change or protect myself from being disappointed again. What would you do if you weren't protecting yourself? She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, I'd tell you that I didn't want to love you, but I did anyway. That somewhere between hosting dinner parties and managing household chaos and watching you work yourself to exhaustion, I started caring about the person underneath the calculation machine. And when you reduced me to a strategic asset, it didn't just insult me, it broke something I'd been trying not to build. Rowan felt something shift in his chest, painful and profound. You loved me. Past tense, I don't anymore. But her voice wavered on the last word, betraying the lie. Elena, don't. She stood abruptly. Don't make declarations you can't keep or promises you'll break the first time business pressures build. Just do the work. Become different. Prove that you can actually see people, see me, as something other than variables in your success equation. And maybe eventually we'll figure out if there's anything worth salvaging between us. She left before he could respond, and Rowan sat alone in her sitting room, surrounded by books she'd read and furniture she'd chosen, and the ghost of a love he'd killed through neglect before it could fully bloom. Over the next 3 weeks, Rowan discovered that becoming a different person was significantly harder than building a railway empire. The rail yard operations resumed with new safety protocols that immediately cut efficiency by 12%. His foreman complained. His accountants blanched at the numbers. Every instinct Rowan had screamed at him to find cost-cutting measures, to optimize, to trim the excess. But he held firm. When his head foreman suggested they could interpret the 8-hour workday rule to allow 10-hour days during peak season, Rowan fired him on the spot and promoted a younger supervisor who'd been advocating for the workers. When an investor called asking if the new safety requirements were flexible in practice, Rowan terminated the relationship immediately. And when his own mind started calculating how much profit he was losing to ethical labor practices, he forced himself to visit the rail yard and watch actual human beings using the safety equipment that was costing him money. It was exhausting. Every decision felt like fighting against years of ingrained instinct. But gradually, something shifted. The workers stopped looking at him with pure suspicion, started offering cautious nods when he walked through the yard. The new foreman reported that productivity was actually increasing despite shorter hours because men weren't working exhausted and making dangerous mistakes. Samuel Brennan stopped by one afternoon with unexpected news. The workers' committee voted. We want to propose an expansion. Rowan looked up from the safety reports he'd been reviewing. What kind of expansion? Profit sharing. Small percentage, maybe 2%, distributed quarterly to workers based on company performance. We calculated it. With your current margins, it's sustainable, and it gives us all incentive to work efficiently instead of just safely. Profit sharing. Rowan tested the words, feeling the instinctive resistance. His profits. His risk. He stopped himself. Not his alone. The workers' labor built everything he profited from. Their skill, their experience, their willingness to risk their lives on his rail lines. 3%, he said. Brennan blinked. Sir, you propose 2%. I'll agree to 3% quarterly profit sharing, but I want the workers' committee to have input on major operational decisions. Not financial strategy, but things that affect safety and working conditions directly. That's more than we asked for. I know. But you were right at the beginning. Long term, keeping workers alive and invested makes more money than grinding them into dust and replacing them. This way, everyone profits when the company succeeds instead of just me. Rowan met Brennan's shocked gaze. Unless you think 3% is too high. No, 3% is... Brennan actually laughed. Who are you, and what did you do with Rowan Blackridge? I'm trying to become someone my wife doesn't regret marrying. Apparently that requires completely restructuring my entire business philosophy. How's that going? Ask me in 6 months when she's seen whether I backslide the first time profits dip. That evening, Rowan did something else he'd never done. He asked Elena if she wanted to have dinner together. Not a formal meal with staff serving courses, but an actual shared dinner where they talked. She agreed, though her expression suggested she expected disappointment. They ate in the smaller dining room, serving themselves from dishes the cook had left warming. It felt strange and almost intimate in a way their formal dinners never had. Brennan proposed profit sharing today, Rowan said. I agreed to 3% quarterly distribution. Elena's fork paused halfway to her mouth. That's significant. It's fair. The workers build everything. They should share in success, not just absorb all the risk. He paused. I also gave the Workers' Committee input on operational decisions affecting safety and conditions. That must have been difficult for you. Sharing control. Terrifying, actually. Every instinct I have says it's a mistake. But those instincts nearly got me killed by people who had every right to hate me, so I'm trying different ones. Elena set down her fork. Why are you telling me this? Because you said to prove I could change. I'm trying to show you the work, not just the results. Even when the work is ugly and difficult and goes against everything I believed for 15 years. And if the profit sharing doesn't work, if efficiency drops and margins collapse, then I'll figure out a new approach that doesn't involve treating workers like disposable assets. I'm done with that calculation. He met her eyes. What did you study in economics? In Paris. The subject changed through her. What? You said you studied economics and philosophy. I want to know what specifically interested you, what papers you wrote, what problems you wanted to solve. Elena studied him suspiciously, like this might be a trap. Then slowly, cautiously, she started talking about labor theory and capital distribution, about the philosophy of moral economics versus pure efficiency, about her thesis on sustainable industrial development that balanced worker welfare with technological progress. Rowan listened, actually listened, and realized she'd been describing solutions to his exact problems for 8 months. If he'd ever bothered to ask her opinion instead of dismissing her as impractical. You basically outlined my entire current restructuring plan in your thesis, he said when she finished. I know. I've been watching you reinvent conclusions I reached 5 years ago through trial and error instead of just asking me. But she said it without bitterness, almost with amusement. Can I read it? Your thesis? Why? Because I'm trying to learn who you are instead of who I assumed you were. And because apparently you've been smarter than me this entire time and I was too arrogant to notice. Something flickered in Elena's expression. Not quite forgiveness, but maybe the possibility of it. It's in the library, 3rd shelf, red binding. After dinner, Rowan found the thesis and spent half the night reading it. Elena's arguments were sophisticated, well-reasoned, and exactly the kind of thinking his business had desperately needed. She'd been sitting in his house with solutions to every problem he'd created, and he dismissed her as someone who read books and tended gardens. The next morning, he found her in the garden, actually tending those gardens he'd scorned. Your thesis is brilliant. She didn't look up from the roses she was pruning. Thank you. I mean it. The framework you proposed for balancing industrial efficiency with human welfare, it's exactly what I've been struggling to figure out. You had it solved years ago. Yes? Well, theory is easier than practice, and no one takes economic philosophy seriously when it comes from a woman who's supposed to be decorative. Rowan knelt beside her, carefully, his ribs still protesting, and waited until she looked at him. I would like to hire you as a consultant for Black Ridge Rail. Elena's pruning shears stopped mid-cut. What? Not as my wife doing unpaid labor, as a professional consultant with an actual salary and formal contract. Your expertise in sustainable industrial development is exactly what the company needs. I'll pay you the same rate I'd pay any economic advisor with your credentials. Rowan, I know this doesn't fix everything. I know paying you doesn't erase 8 months of dismissing your intelligence and work. But I want to start treating you like the brilliant strategist you are instead of the decorative asset I assumed you were. If you're willing. Elena set down her pruning shears, her hands shaking slightly. You're offering to pay me to help fix the business I was sabotaging a month ago. You weren't sabotaging it. You were exposing fundamental flaws in systems I'd built on exploitation. Now I'm trying to rebuild those systems ethically, and you're the best person I know to help me do it. Not because you're my wife, but because you're genuinely better at this than I am. She stared at him for a long moment. Then, incredibly, she laughed. This is the strangest redemption arc I've ever witnessed. Is that a yes? It's a, let me think about whether I want to professionally attach myself to a man who's still figuring out basic human decency. But she was almost smiling. Ask me again in a week. I'll ask you in 6 days just to be annoying. That's very human of you. I'm learning. The week that followed brought unexpected validation from an unlikely source. Thomas Wickshire returned with 4 other Philadelphia investors. They'd been watching Rowan's restructuring efforts, and they wanted in. Not with blind faith, but with cautious investment tied to continued ethical practices. My wife started a reading group, Wickshire explained. Bunch of industrialists' wives discussing economic philosophy and business ethics. Your wife's been contributing. Apparently half of Philadelphia society now thinks sustainable labor practices are fashionable. You've accidentally started a movement. Rowan glanced at Elena, who was sitting in on the meeting at his request. She looked utterly unsurprised. I didn't accidentally do anything, she said calmly. I deliberately introduced economic theory to social circles that influence their husbands' investment decisions. If industrialists won't listen to moral arguments, maybe they'll listen to their wives and peer pressure. The investors looked uncomfortable. Rowan felt something like pride. So you're all here because your wives told you to invest ethically or sleep on the couch? Essentially, one of the investors admitted, but also because the numbers work. Your efficiency is recovering despite new safety protocols. Worker retention is up. Injury costs are down. The profit-sharing model is generating better productivity than fear-based management ever did. He paused. Turns out treating workers like humans instead of disposable assets is actually good business. Who knew? My wife knew, Rowan said. 5 years ago in her thesis, I just wasn't smart enough to listen. Elena met his eyes across the conference table, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement, recognition. The beginning of something that might eventually become partnership instead of transaction. After the investors left, Elena stayed behind. That was strategically sound, she said, publicly crediting me in front of investors. It positions the company as collaborative and forward-thinking. That's not why I did it? No. I did it because it's true. And because I'm trying to get comfortable with admitting when I'm wrong and someone else is right. Even if, especially if, that someone is you. Elena moved to the window, looking out at the rail yard where workers were ending their 8-hour shifts instead of being worked until exhaustion. You've made real changes, she said quietly. Structural ones that will hold even when the initial enthusiasm fades. That's more than I expected. But I don't know if you've changed or if you're just performing change because you're terrified of losing everything again. She turned to face him. How do I know this is genuine transformation instead of sophisticated survival instinct? You don't. I don't even know. Maybe I can't separate the two. Maybe I needed to lose everything to become capable of caring about anything other than profit. Rowan moved closer, not invading her space, just closing the distance slightly. But I know that I read your thesis 3 times because I wanted to understand how you think. I know that I asked Brennan about his family because I realized I didn't know if he had kids. I know that I looked at the workers yesterday and saw people instead of labor costs for the first time in my life. Whether that's transformation or performance, I can't tell you. But it feels different. Elena studied him with those sharp, analytical eyes that had been seen through him since the beginning. Ask me again, she said finally. Ask you what? To be your consultant. You said you'd ask in 6 days. It's been 6 days. Rowan felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Hope, maybe. Or the beginning of it. Elena Blackridge, will you consult for Blackridge Rail Company on sustainable industrial development with full compensation and formal recognition of your expertise? Yes, on one condition. Name it. You attend my wife's reading group discussion next month on economic philosophy and moral business practices. You'll be the only man there, and you'll listen to women discuss ideas you've been ignoring from them for years. Done. You agreed very quickly. Because sitting in a room full of intelligent women discussing economic theory sounds significantly more productive than sitting in rooms full of men congratulating each other on their ruthlessness. He paused. And because I want to learn how to see the world the way you do, even if it means being uncomfortable. Elena extended her hand formally, like they were sealing a business arrangement. Rowan shook it, feeling the strange combination of professional distance and intimate possibility. Then we have a contract, Mr. Blackridge. We do, Mrs. Blackridge. She didn't let go of his hand immediately, just stood there, their fingers intertwined, something shifting in her expression. I'm still angry with you, she said quietly. You should be. And I don't trust this yet. Any of it. I wouldn't trust me either. But, she tightened her grip slightly. But I want to. I want to believe you're actually becoming someone different, someone who sees people, someone who might eventually be capable of the partnership I thought we could have. I'm trying. It's messy and slow, and I keep making mistakes, but I'm trying. I know. She released his hand, stepped back. That's the only reason I'm still here. 2 weeks later, Rowan attended the wives' reading group, 14 women in a Philadelphia drawing room, discussing labor theory and capital ethics with more sophistication than most of his board meetings. He sat in the back, listened, and realized he'd been operating in a world where half the intellectual capacity was systematically ignored because it came from women. Elena led the discussion, and watching her engage with complex economic theory in her element was like seeing her for the first time. This was who she'd been all along: brilliant, strategic, engaged. He'd just been too narrow-minded to notice. Afterward, Thomas Wickshire's wife cornered him. "Your wife is remarkable." "I know. I'm slow, but I'm learning." "See that you do. Because if you waste her again, every woman in this room will make sure you never do business in Philadelphia again. We protect our own." It was a threat and a welcome simultaneously. Rowan found he respected both. On the carriage ride home, Elena was quiet, but not distant. "You actually listened in there," she said. "I'm trying to make a habit of it." "Mrs. Wickshire threatened you, didn't she?" "Comprehensively. I'm apparently on probation with half of Philadelphia society." Elena smiled, a real smile, the first he'd seen in weeks. "Good. You should be." When they arrived home, Rowan walked her to her sitting room. At the door, he paused. "Thank you for giving me a chance I don't deserve." "You're welcome. Don't waste it." "I won't." He started to leave, but she caught his arm. "Rowan?" He turned back, and she was closer than expected, her expression complicated. "I'm not ready to forgive you yet, or to trust this completely. But I'm also not ready to give up on the possibility that you might actually become the man I needed you to be 8 months ago." "That's more than I have any right to ask for." "Yes, it is. But apparently I'm foolish enough to hope anyway." She released his arm. "Good night." "Good night, Elena." He left her standing in the doorway, and for the first time since the gala, Rowan went to bed feeling like he might actually have a chance at becoming something other than the hollow calculation machine he'd been. It wouldn't be easy. Elena's trust was shattered, his reputation was damaged, and his entire business model was being rebuilt from foundations that prioritized people over pure profit. But somewhere in the wreckage of his empire, something new was growing. And maybe, just maybe, it would be something worth having. 3 months later, Rowan stood in front of the Black Ridge Rail Company Board of Directors and did something unprecedented in the company's 15-year history. He told them no. "Gentlemen, I understand your concerns about the profit margins," he said, keeping his voice level despite the hostile stares around the table. "But I will not be rolling back the safety protocols or the profit-sharing agreement. Those are permanent changes, not temporary concessions." James Mercer, the oldest board member and a man who'd invested in Rowan's first rail line, leaned forward with barely contained irritation. "The numbers don't lie, Blackridge. We're down 18% from projections. The new equipment costs are bleeding us dry, and giving workers a cut of profits that they didn't risk capital to earn is fiscally irresponsible. The workers risked their lives. I'd say that's a more significant investment than capital." Rowan met Mercer's glare without flinching. "And the 18% loss is temporary. Worker productivity is up 23% since we implemented 8-hour days and proper safety equipment. Injury-related delays are down 40%. We're building a sustainable model instead of constantly replacing dead or maimed workers." "That's very noble," another board member said sarcastically. "But we're not running a charity. We're running a business. We're running both. And if you can't accept that, I'll buy out your shares at current market value." The room went silent. Mercer's face flushed dark red. "You can't afford to buy us all out, not after the strike losses and your expensive moral awakening." "Actually, I can." Rowan slid a folder across the table. Elena, Mrs. Blackridge, ran the numbers. "With the Philadelphia investors' renewed confidence and the new sustainability contracts we've secured, I have sufficient capital to buy out any board member who can't support the current direction. Your choice. Stay and profit from a company that values human life, or leave with fair compensation." 3 board members took the buyout offer. The rest stayed, though some looked mutinous about it. After the meeting, Elena was waiting in the hallway. She'd attended as his official consultant, sitting quietly in the corner taking notes, but Rowan had felt her presence like an anchor, keeping him steady. "That was risky," she said as they walked to his office. "Mercer might rally the others against you. Let him try. I'm done compromising on this. Either we build something sustainable or I'll build it alone." He glanced at her. "Your numbers were solid. How did you know the Philadelphia group would increase their investment?" "Because I've been having tea with their wives for 3 months. They're all watching to see if this transformation holds. Today's board meeting will be discussed at every dinner table in Philadelphia by tomorrow night. You just proved you're serious." "I am serious. I'm also terrified I'm going to bankrupt the company trying to be ethical." Elena's expression softened slightly. "You won't. The model works. It just requires patience and a longer view than quarterly profits." They reached his office, and Rowan held the door for her. A small gesture, but one he'd started making deliberately, treating her like a professional partner instead of incidental furniture. Inside, she settled into the chair across from his desk. It had become her chair over the past months, where she sat during their daily strategy sessions. The office had changed too, less austere, more human. Books on labor economics Elena had recommended. Photographs of the rail lines that showed workers, not just infrastructure. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Elena said, pulling out a document. "I've been approached by the Women's Industrial Reform Association. They want me to speak at their national conference about sustainable business practices." "That's excellent. You should do it." "It would mean traveling to Boston for a week, and it would make me more publicly associated with labor advocacy, which could impact your business relationships." Rowan studied her carefully. This was a test, whether she intended it or not. The old Rowan would have calculated the political cost, might have discouraged her to protect his interests. "Elena, you're one of the smartest economic minds I know. If people want to hear you speak, you should speak. And anyone who has a problem with my wife advocating for workers' rights isn't someone I want doing business with anyway." She blinked, surprise flickering across her face. "You've really changed." "I'm trying to. Some days are harder than others." "I've noticed." She paused. "Last week, when the Hartford extension hit that delay, I saw you start to snap at the foreman. Then you stopped, took a breath, and asked what support he needed instead." "You saw that?" "I see everything, Rowan. I always have." "You're just finally worth watching without wanting to burn your empire down." It was the closest she'd come to a compliment in months, and Rowan felt it settle warm in his chest. "Will you come back?" he asked. "From Boston?" "Of course. I'm contracted through the end of the year." "That's not what I meant." Elena met his eyes, and the air between them shifted into something heavier, more complicated. "I don't know what you meant." "Yes, you do." She stood abruptly, gathering her papers. "I should go. I have correspondence to finish." "Elena, don't." She paused at the door, her back to him. "Don't ask me questions I'm not ready to answer. I'm here. I'm working with you. I'm giving you chances to prove you've changed. But I'm not ready for more than that." "How will I know when you're ready?" "You won't. That's the point. Love isn't a transaction you can measure and predict. It's something that grows or doesn't, and right now it's barely a seedling trying to survive in scorched earth." She turned slightly. "Keep watering it. Keep giving it light, and maybe it'll grow into something. Or maybe it won't, but you don't get to know which until it happens." She left, and Rowan sat alone in his office, feeling the truth of her words settle over him like weight. He'd spent his whole life trying to control outcomes through calculation. But this, rebuilding trust, earning love, becoming worthy of a woman he'd dismissed, couldn't be engineered. It could only be lived, day by day, choice by choice. The next crisis came 2 weeks later. A competing rail company, Garrison Rail, the one that had bought the Hartford route, suffered a catastrophic accident. 12 workers dead when a bridge collapsed during construction. The investigation revealed systematic safety violations, cut corners, and the same kind of profit over people calculations Rowan had made for years. The newspapers covered it extensively. The public outcry was fierce, and several investors came to Rowan suggesting he use the disaster to his advantage. "This is your opportunity," Wickshire said during an emergency meeting. "Garrison's reputation is destroyed. Their investors are fleeing. You could absorb their routes and infrastructure at pennies on the dollar. Rowan looked at the acquisition proposal on his desk. It was everything the old version of him would have jumped on. A competitor crippled, assets available at rock-bottom prices, market expansion through someone else's disaster. No. The investors stared at him. No? Wickshire repeated. Blackridge, this is a once-in-a-decade opportunity. Garrison's collapse opens up the entire Western Territory. I know. And if I swoop in to profit from dead workers, I'm no better than I was before the strike. Worse, actually, because now I'd be doing it knowing better. Rowan stood, pacing to the window. Garrison's workers just lost colleagues. 12 families just lost their primary income. The last thing they need is me buying their company and making their tragedy part of my expansion strategy. Then what do you suggest? Another investor asked. We just let some other vulture pick the bones? I suggest we offer those workers jobs. With our safety standards, our profit-sharing model, and our 8-hour days. Let them choose whether to work for someone who values their lives or go back to the same system that killed their friends. That's not acquisition. That's just poaching workers. Exactly. We're not buying failed infrastructure. We're offering skilled workers a better option. If enough of them join us, Garrison collapses on its own, and we build new infrastructure the right way instead of inheriting their death traps. The investors looked at each other uncertainly. Wickshire spoke carefully. That's more expensive and slower than just buying them out. Yes, it's also the right thing to do. And if you can't support that, I'll understand if you want to withdraw your investments. Another silence. Then Wickshire laughed. Actually laughed. My wife is going to love this. She's been waiting to see if you'd backslide the first time Easy Profit showed up. You just passed her test. I didn't do it for your wife's approval. I know, that's why it counts, son. Wickshire extended his hand. All right, Blackridge, we'll do it your way, but those Garrison workers better be as skilled as you think. After the investors left, Rowan found Elena in the library. She was reading in the window seat, her favorite spot, he'd learned. Afternoon light made her dark hair almost copper. I turned down the Garrison acquisition. She looked up. I heard. The whole house heard. Your investors weren't quiet about their concerns. Do you think I made the right call? Does it matter what I think? Yes, you're my consultant, and you're smarter than me. Your opinion matters. Elena set down her book, studying him with that analytical gaze that had terrified and fascinated him in equal measure. I think the old Rowan would have bought Garrison without hesitation and called it smart business. The new Rowan recognized that profiting from worker deaths, even indirectly, contradicts everything you've been trying to build. So yes, I think you made the right call, but more importantly, I think you made it without needing my validation. That's growth. I wanted your validation anyway. I know, that's also growth. She stood, moving closer. Rowan, I need to tell you something. His heart seized. What? I'm going to Boston next week for the conference, and while I'm there, I'm going to stay with my father. He's been asking me to visit, and I need some distance, some time to think without you being in the next room trying so hard to be better. How long? 2 weeks, maybe 3. It felt like losing ground he'd barely gained. Are you coming back? I don't know. She said it gently, but honestly. I'm not leaving permanently. But I need space to figure out if what I'm feeling is forgiveness or just exhaustion. If this hope I keep trying to suppress is real or just me wanting so badly to believe you've changed that I'm ignoring warning signs. What warning signs? That's what I need to figure out. Away from you. Away from the daily proof of your efforts. Away from… She trailed off. Away from what? Away from wanting to forgive you before I'm sure I should. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. I'll be here when you get back, Rowan said. However long you need. I'll be here doing the work, building something worth coming back to. I know you will. That's part of what scares me. You're becoming the man I wanted you to be, and I don't know if I can trust it yet. If I can trust that it's real and permanent instead of just a very sophisticated performance. How do I prove it's real? You can't. Time proves it, or it doesn't. That's what I need to figure out, whether I'm willing to risk waiting to find out. She left for Boston 3 days later. Rowan watched her carriage disappear down the drive and felt the absence like a physical ache. The house was too quiet without her. The daily strategy sessions felt hollow. Even the garden looked different, less vibrant, like something vital had been removed. Peter found him standing in the garden a week into Elena's absence, staring at the roses she'd been tending. "Sir, the garrison workers are here. 37 of them total. They're asking about the employment offer." Rowan pulled himself together. "Send them to the rail yard. I'll meet them there." The garrison workers looked exactly like his own workers had looked months ago, exhausted, wary, carrying the weight of trauma and uncertainty. Rowan recognized the look because he'd put it on his own employees' faces for years. Samuel Brennan stood with them. He'd been helping coordinate the outreach to the displaced workers. "Mr. Blackridge, this is Marcus Grant. He was the foreman at Garrison before the collapse." Grant was a man in his 40s with a scar across his jaw and eyes that had seen too much death. "We heard about your safety standards," Grant said without preamble. "About the profit sharing and the 8-hour days sounds too good to be true." "It's true. Ask my workers. Ask Brennan. Ask anyone who's been here since we restructured. Why should we trust you? You're just another industrialist looking for cheap labor." "You shouldn't trust me. You should trust the contract I'm offering and the independent oversight that ensures I follow it." Rowan gestured to the rail yard. "Come look at the equipment, talk to my workers, see the safety protocols in action. Then decide if you want to work for someone who values your life or keep looking for employment with someone who'll treat you like Garrison did." The Garrison workers spent 2 hours inspecting the rail yard, talking to Blackridge workers, examining the safety equipment and contracts. Rowan watched from a distance, letting them investigate without interference. Finally, Grant approached. "Your workers say you used to be as bad as Garrison, that you changed after a strike nearly destroyed your company." "That's accurate." "What changed?" Rowan considered lying, softening the truth, but Elena's voice echoed in his head. "Prove it's real through honesty." "My wife made me see that I'd built an empire on human suffering because I was too focused on profit to notice the cost. She systematically dismantled everything I'd built to force me to look at what I'd been ignoring. When I finally looked, really looked, I realized I'd become exactly the kind of man I should have despised. So I'm trying to become different. It's slow and hard and I make mistakes, but I'm trying." Grant studied him for a long moment. "Your wife did that? Took apart your empire?" "Piece by piece. She's smarter than me and had access to all my vulnerabilities. When she decided I needed to learn a lesson, she taught it comprehensively." "Is she here? I'd like to meet the woman who brought down Rowan Blackridge." "She's in Boston. She needed distance from me to figure out if I'm genuinely different or just performing change to win her back." "Which is it?" "I don't know yet. Ask me in a year when I've proven it one way or the other." Grant actually smiled. Honest answer. "All right, Blackridge, we'll give you a try. But understand, we're watching. One safety violation, one attempt to undermine the agreements you made, and we walk. And we'll make sure everyone in the industry knows why." "Fair enough." 29 of the 37 Garrison workers signed on. It was the largest single hiring in Blackridge Rail's history, and every newspaper in 3 states covered it. The narrative was irresistible. The ruthless industrialist who'd found ethics and was now rescuing workers from his competitor's disaster. Rowan hated the narrative because it made him look noble instead of just less terrible than before. But the workers were employed. Garrison collapsed entirely a week later, and Blackridge Rail's reputation began shifting from cautionary tale to possible model for change. Elena was still in Boston. She sent letters, brief, polite updates about her father's health and the conference. Nothing personal. Nothing about whether she was coming back or when. Rowan wrote back, telling her about the Garrison workers, the company's improving reputation, the small daily choices he was making to be better. He didn't ask when she was returning, didn't pressure or plead, just kept doing the work and hoping it would be enough. 2 weeks became 3. 3 became 4. Rowan was beginning to accept that she might not come back when a telegram arrived. Returning Friday. Decisions made. E. Friday came with agonizing slowness. Rowan tried to work but couldn't focus, tried to read but couldn't absorb words, finally gave up and just waited in the library where he'd have a view of the drive. The carriage arrived at dusk. Elena stepped out wearing a dark blue traveling dress, carrying a single bag. She looked tired but composed, and Rowan's heart hammered as he watched her approach the house. He met her in the entrance hall. They stood facing each other across marble floors, and the silence stretched unbearably. How was Boston? Completely inadequate, but he didn't trust himself to ask what he actually wanted to know. Productive. The conference went well. My father is improving. She set down her bag. I did a lot of thinking. And? And I'm still angry with you. For the gala, for 8 months of dismissal, for building an empire I had to destroy to make you see basic humanity. Rowan's stomach dropped. I understand. But I'm also exhausted from being angry, and I'm tired of protecting myself from the possibility that you might actually have changed, so I've made a decision. What decision? Elena pulled something from her pocket, a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him, and Rowan recognized it immediately. The marriage dissolution papers he'd drafted months ago, the ones she'd torn up. I found the pieces in my desk drawer, she said. I've been carrying them around Boston, trying to decide if I should have you draft new ones. Rowan couldn't breathe. Did you decide? Yes. She took the paper back from him, unfolded it carefully. I decided that if you want to be married to me, really married, not just contractually linked, you need to start over, not with legal documents or strategic arrangements. With a real courtship where you actually see me as a person you want to know instead of an asset you acquired. Elena, I'm not asking you to fall in love with me on command. I'm asking you to date me, court me properly, learn who I actually am instead of who you assumed I was, and let me learn if the man you're becoming is someone I can actually build a life with instead of just an improved version of someone who hurt me. Rowan stared at her, processing. You want me to court you, my own wife. I want you to earn me, not through contracts or settlements or calculated gestures, through genuine effort to know me and value me and build something real instead of transactional. And if I fail, if you decide I'm not worth it, then we end this marriage properly, as two people who tried and couldn't make it work, not as a buyer and an asset, but as equals who gave it an honest chance. She held up the torn dissolution papers. But if you succeed, if you actually become the partner I needed instead of the strategist who married me for land, then maybe we build something real, something that was earned instead of purchased. Rowan felt something crack open in his chest, painful and terrifying and full of possibility. I don't know how to court someone. I married you through calculated moves and strategic timing. I don't know how to just be with someone. Then learn. Ask me questions. Take me places. Spend time with me because you want to, not because you're trying to solve me like a business problem. She stepped closer. I know it's strange, Rowan, courting your own wife like you're starting over, but we are starting over. Everything that came before was built on false foundations. If we want something real, we have to build it properly this time. What if I'm terrible at it? You probably will be. You're terrible at everything emotional. But you're also stubborn and willing to learn and apparently capable of more growth than I gave you credit for. So you'll be terrible at first, and then maybe less terrible, and eventually you might even be good at it. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. No, it's a realistic assessment. I'm done with romantic illusions, Rowan. I want something real, even if real means messy and difficult and uncertain. She met his eyes directly. So, will you court me properly? Will you try to earn what you thought you'd already bought? Rowan knew this was a test, maybe the most important one. He could see the fear underneath her challenge, the hope she was trying to protect by wrapping it in practical terms. Yes, he said, I will court you. I will try to earn you, and I will probably be terrible at it, but I'll keep trying until I figure it out or you decide I'm hopeless. Something shifted in Elena's expression, not quite a smile, but close. Then let's start over. Hello, Rowan Blackridge. I'm Elena Weiermont. I studied economics in Paris. I believe in sustainable industrial development, and I just spent a month deciding whether to give you a chance you probably don't deserve. He understood. This was the reset, the beginning of something new built on honesty instead of calculation. Hello, Elena Weiermont. I'm Rowan Blackridge. I built an empire on exploitation, lost it to my own blindness, and I'm trying to become someone worthy of a woman who's far too good for me. Better, honest, if unflattering. She extended her hand formally. Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? Not a formal meal with staff serving courses, but an actual dinner where we talk? I would like that very much. Good. 7 o'clock. And Rowan? Yes? Don't try to impress me. Don't calculate what I want to hear. Just talk to me like I'm a person you want to know. That's all I'm asking for. She left him standing in the entrance hall, and Rowan felt like he'd just been given something precious and terrifying. A genuine chance to build something real with the woman he'd dismissed as incidental. The next 6 weeks were unlike anything Rowan had experienced. He courted Elena like a nervous suitor instead of a husband who thought he'd already secured the asset. He took her to dinner at small restaurants instead of grand establishments designed to impress investors. He asked about her day, her opinions, her dreams. He listened when she talked about economic theory and didn't try to redirect conversations toward his business interests. It was awkward at first. His instincts kept pushing him toward strategic conversation, toward trying to solve her like a problem, but Elena called him on it every time. You're doing it again, trying to figure out what I want instead of just being present. I don't know how to just be present. I've spent 34 years trying to stay 3 steps ahead. Then slow down. Be here, in this moment, talking to me about something that doesn't matter to your business empire. Tell me something real. So he told her about watching his father collapse after his mother died, about being 12 years old and deciding emotion was dangerous, about building walls so high that he'd locked himself away from everything that made life worth living. And she told him about her mother's illness, about watching her father spend everything trying to save someone who was already lost, about deciding that loving someone was the most dangerous thing a person could do. We're both terrified, she said one evening over dinner. You of caring too much, me of not being cared about at all. That's what makes this so hard. What makes it possible? He asked. The fact that you're trying, that you keep showing up even when it's uncomfortable, that you haven't tried to buy your way back into my good graces or manipulate me into forgiveness. She paused. You're learning to be human, Rowan, slowly, messily, but genuinely, and that matters more than grand gestures. The turning point came 3 months after Elena's return. The Blackridge Rail Company secured a massive contract for Western expansion, everything Rowan had been building toward for years. The terms were excellent, the profits would be substantial, and success would cement the company's position as the dominant rail line in the Eastern Territories. There was one problem. The timeline required cutting some corners on the initial construction to meet deadlines. Nothing egregious. The contract language had loopholes that would let him use slightly lower-grade materials on non-critical sections, reduce some safety protocols during the setup phase, push workers to 10-hour days temporarily. All technically legal, all the kind of thing he would have done without hesitation a year ago. The board was unanimous. Take the contract, use the loopholes, maximize profit. The workers' committee was less certain but willing to compromise temporarily for such a significant opportunity. Even Elena, reviewing the numbers, admitted it was an incredible deal. This contract would set you up for the next decade, she said. It's everything you've been working toward. Rowan sat in his office, staring at the contract. 10 years of security, expansion into territories he'd been dreaming about since he started the company, wealth and influence beyond what he'd lost during the strike. All he had to do was compromise slightly on the principles he'd spent a year building. He picked up a pen, put it down, picked it up again. Elena watched from her chair. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that a year ago I would have signed this without question. 6 months ago, I might have struggled, but convinced myself the loopholes were acceptable. Now I'm looking at it, and all I can see is the moment I start backsliding. It's not the same as before, Rowan. You're not exploiting workers or ignoring safety. You're using legal flexibility in a contract to meet aggressive timelines. Legal isn't the same as right. No, but it's also not the same as wrong. There's gray area here. I spent 15 years living in gray area and calling it wisdom. It nearly got me killed and definitely cost me you. He set down the pen. I don't want to be the man who lives in gray areas anymore. I want to be someone who draws clear lines and doesn't cross them even when it's expensive. This contract is a once-in-a-decade opportunity. I know. And if I take it with compromises, I'll spend the next decade wondering when I'll compromise again. Wondering if you'll be watching for the moment I prove I haven't really changed. Elena's expression shifted, something raw and vulnerable breaking through. I'm always watching for that moment. I can't help it. I'm terrified you'll backslide the second I let my guard down. I know. That's why I can't sign this, not with loopholes and compromises. Either we do it right, or we don't do it at all. He stood, walked to the door, called for Peter. Send a telegram to Morrison and Associates. Tell them we're declining the Western expansion contract as written, but we're willing to negotiate a revised timeline that allows us to maintain full safety protocols and standard work hours, even if it costs more and takes longer. Peter's eyes widened. Sir, they might not be willing to renegotiate. This could be a take it or leave it situation. Then we leave it. After Peter left, Elena stood slowly, moving around the desk until she was standing directly in front of Rowan. You just turned down everything you've been building toward. I turned down the version that required compromising what I've become. If they renegotiate, excellent. If they don't, I'll find another path that doesn't require me to backslide into the man I used to be. Why? Because I'm not doing this to win you back anymore. I'm doing this because I don't want to be that man. Not for you, not for the workers, not even for myself. I want to be someone who draws lines and keeps them, who doesn't compromise on human welfare for profit, who actually believes that some things matter more than money. He met her eyes. I want to be someone you could love without fear that he'll revert to calculated cruelty the moment it's convenient. Elena's composure finally cracked. Her eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months. You just gave up a decade of security to prove a point. I gave up a decade of compromises to become the man I should have been all along. She kissed him. It wasn't calculated or strategic or measured. It was raw and desperate and full of months of suppressed emotion breaking through. Rowan froze for a shocked second, then kissed her back, his good arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her close. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elena's cheeks were wet. I'm still scared, she whispered. So am I. I don't know if I can fully trust this yet. I know. But I want to try. I want to believe you've actually changed, that this isn't performance or strategy, but genuine transformation. It is. I swear to you, Elena, this is real. Messy and slow and imperfect, but real. She kissed him again, softer this time. Then court me properly, Rowan Blackridge. Earn me through truth instead of calculation. Build something with me that's worthy of both of us. I will. I am. Every day. The Western expansion contract was renegotiated 3 weeks later with revised timelines that accommodated full safety protocols. The profit margins were tighter, but sustainable. Rowan signed it without hesitation. 6 months after that, the Blackridge Rail Company was featured in a national business journal as a model for sustainable industrial development. Samuel Brennan and Rowan were interviewed together, discussing the transition from exploitation to ethical labor practices. What changed? The journalist asked Rowan. I stopped measuring success purely in profits and started measuring it in whether I could look my workers in the eye without shame, whether my wife could be proud of what we're building instead of being forced to dismantle it to teach me basic humanity. Elena, sitting beside him during the interview, added, Change isn't a single moment. It's 1,000 small choices to be better than you were yesterday. My husband makes those choices every day. Some days are harder than others, but he keeps choosing to be the man his workers and his wife deserve instead of the man his greed wants him to be. Do you trust him now? The journalist asked. Elena looked at Rowan, and something passed between them, complicated and hard-won and real. I'm learning to. Trust, like transformation, is built through consistency over time. Ask me in a year, in 5 years, in 10. Every day he proves it's real is another day I learn to believe it. On their first anniversary, not of their wedding, but of the day Elena returned from Boston and asked him to court her properly, Rowan took her back to the garden where she'd been pruning roses the day he'd offered her a dissolution contract. The garden had grown wild over the year. Elena had been too busy consulting and speaking and building her own reputation as an economic reformer to maintain it. I'm sorry I let it get away from me, she said, looking at the overgrown beds. I thought we could fix it together. You don't know anything about gardening? Then teach me. Teach me about roses and proper pruning and whatever else you do out here. I want to learn the things you care about instead of dismissing them as irrelevant. They spent the afternoon working in the garden. Rowan was terrible at it, cutting things he shouldn't and missing obvious dead growth. But Elena guided his hands patiently, showing him how to see what needed removing and what needed nurturing. "It's not that different from business transformation," she said at one point. "You have to remove what's dead or dying, even if it's painful. And you have to nurture what has potential to grow, even if you can't see the blooms yet." "Is that what you've been doing? Nurturing potential while removing dead growth?" "Yes. Some days I wanted to burn the whole garden down. Some days I could see the possibility underneath the damage. Most days I just kept working and hoping something good would grow." Rowan set down his pruning shears, taking her dirt-covered hands in his. Something good did grow. We grew. Not perfectly, not easily, but genuinely. You took a man who measured everything and taught him that some things can't be calculated, that love has to be built and earned and chosen every single day. Elena smiled, and it was unguarded in a way he rarely saw. "You're getting better at this, the emotional honesty thing. I have an excellent teacher. I'm not teaching you anymore, Rowan. You're doing the work yourself. I'm just watching to make sure you don't forget why it matters." "I'll never forget. How could I? I almost lost everything, my business, my reputation, you, because I forgot that people matter more than profit, that love is worth more than efficiency, that being vulnerable is stronger than being calculating." He kissed her there in the garden, surrounded by roses they were learning to tend together. It wasn't the passionate desperation of months ago, but something steadier, deeper, built on a foundation of trust that was slowly, carefully being reconstructed. When they pulled apart, Elena rested her forehead against his. "I love you," she said quietly. "I fought it for months, tried to protect myself from it, but I love you anyway. The man you're becoming, the partner you're learning to be. Even knowing you'll make mistakes and struggle and have days where you want to fall back into old patterns. I love you too. I didn't know how to until you taught me, until you showed me that loving someone means seeing them, valuing them, choosing them, even when it's inconvenient or expensive or requires giving up control." They stayed in the garden until dusk, working side by side, building something together that couldn't be measured in quarterly profits or strategic acquisitions. Building a life that was earned instead of purchased, messy, imperfect, and absolutely real. Years later, when people asked Rowan Blackridge what changed him from a ruthless industrialist to a model for ethical business practices, he always gave the same answer. "My wife taught me that you can't build an empire worth having on foundations of human suffering, that the strongest structures are built on partnership, respect, and the daily choice to see people instead of assets. I lost everything learning that lesson, but I gained something far more valuable, a woman who believed I could become better than I was, and the chance to prove she was right." And Elena, when asked what made her stay with a man who dismissed her as irrelevant, would smile and say, "Because he didn't just apologize. He transformed. Because he chose to become worthy of love instead of trying to buy it. Because every single day he wakes up and chooses to be the man I needed instead of the man he was. That's not romance, that's partnership. And partnership is worth fighting for." They built their empire together, not on exploitation, but on sustainability. Not on calculations, but on caring. Not on transactions, but on trust that was earned through 1,000 small choices to be better than yesterday. And in the end, that empire was far more valuable than anything Rowan had built before. Because it was built on love that had been earned, not bought. And love that's earned is the only kind worth having.